Our journey spans across the vast landscapes of the United States and into the dark mysteries of the open seas, tracing an unforgettable path through the shadows of human history and the unexplained anomalies of our world. We begin on the cold, soot-stained streets of mid-century Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, before moving to a quiet, unsettling suburban neighborhood in Springfield, Missouri. We will walk through the heavy, oppressive silence of a home in Villisca, Iowa, and venture into the suffocating granite depths of a notorious railway tunnel in Massachusetts. From there, our path crosses the ocean to the shifting currents of the Strait of Malacca, returns to the dense, unwelcoming timber of Clifton, Virginia, and enters the high strangeness of the Uinta Basin in Utah. Finally, we will uncover centuries-old patterns of sudden medical anomalies in Salem, Massachusetts, follow impossible bipedal prints through the frozen marshlands of southern New Jersey, and stand within an invisible, technology-draining boundary at the historic battlefield of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Each of these locations holds a secret that has challenged the limits of forensic science, structural law, and human understanding. And if you'd like, leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from. Our first destination takes us to a desolate, brush-covered lot on the outskirts of Philadelphia, where a routine discovery would unearth a case so profoundly engineered it would take the global forensic community more than 6 decades just to uncover the true identity of a child lost to time. Under the stark, clinical glare of a modern laboratory microscope, a forensic specialist in late 2022 adjusted the focus on a high-resolution digital scan of a preserved dermal sample. The team of investigators surrounding the terminal expected to see the standard signs of post-mortem cellular degradation, or perhaps the typical flattening of tissue caused by decades of environmental exposure. Instead, as the pixels sharpened, an unsettling silence fell over the room. The complex system of ridges and valleys that should have formed a completely unique set of identifiers was entirely absent. The skin surface was completely uniform, smooth, and devoid of any natural linear patterns. It looked as though the biological history of the individual had been deliberately deleted. This was not the result of natural decomposition, nor was it a rare genetic mutation. The borders of the tissue showed precise microabrasions, a pattern that could only be left by a meticulous, highly calculated physical or chemical intervention executed with professional precision. The detectives in the room realized they were not merely looking at the tragic remains of an unidentified historical casualty. They were looking at a masterclass in forensic erasure, a tactical operation designed to ensure that even if the individual was discovered, the state would never be able to trace them back to a point of origin. To understand how this biological puzzle ended up in a contemporary forensic lab, one must step backward into the complex cultural landscape of Philadelphia during the late 1950s. The city was experiencing a massive post-war industrial boom, characterized by a rapidly expanding infrastructure, crowded inner-city tenements, and a constant influx of transient laborers seeking employment in the textile mills and manufacturing plants. Amid this rapid growth, the municipal administrative systems struggled to keep pace. Thousands of children born within the shifting boundaries of these working-class neighborhoods were never officially registered with the state, existing entirely outside the network of public health ledgers, hospital birth records, and educational databases. This institutional void created a thriving environment for unregulated foster homes, informal adoption networks, and under-the-radar care facilities that operated with zero government oversight. In these environments, children could be moved across state lines or transferred between families based on verbal agreements and cash transactions, leaving absolutely no paper trail behind. It was a time when a human life could exist completely within the fabric of a community, yet remain completely invisible to the legal framework of the country. The fragile illusion of this hidden system shattered on a freezing morning in February of 1957 along a desolate stretch of Susquehanna Road. A local resident checking a series of small animal traps in the underbrush noticed a discarded item resting among the dead weeds and patches of melting snow. It was a large, sturdy cardboard box that had originally contained a luxury baby bassinet manufactured and sold by a prominent regional department store. The container seemed entirely out of place in the remote field, prompting the individual to approach and peer inside the open cardboard flaps. Rested carefully at the bottom of the box were the remains of a young boy, estimated to be between 4 and 6 years of age. The scene inside the container was chillingly orderly. The child was completely unclothed, wrapped tightly in a piece of faded flannel cloth, and positioned with his legs neatly crossed to fit the dimensions of the cardboard repository. His body bore the undeniable signatures of severe long-term malnutrition and multiple instances of blunt force trauma across his torso and extremities. What struck the responding officers as deeply anomalous, however, was the condition of the boy's hair. It had been recently cut, chopped down to the scalp in crude, uneven clumps that still clung to his shoulders, suggesting that someone had desperately attempted to alter his physical appearance immediately prior to placing him in the lot. The Philadelphia Police Department launched one of the most extensive and resource-heavy homicide investigations in the history of Pennsylvania. Recognizing that they had zero identity data to work with, detectives printed and distributed over 400,000 flyers featuring a post-mortem photograph of the child, meticulously restored by an artist to appear alive and dressed in clean clothing. Every household in the city received the flyer with their monthly utility bills, and copies were posted in every post office, police station, and storefront across the tri-state area. The massive publicity wave quickly generated a flurry of tips, leading investigators down a series of complex red herrings. The first major lead emerged when a persistent medical examiner focused on a private foster home located approximately 1.5 miles from the disposal site. A regional psychic claimed that a house matching the description of the foster facility held the answers to the crime. When detectives searched the home, they discovered a selection of department store bassinets that precisely matched the cardboard container found in the lot. The foster father became the primary target of public suspicion, with theories suggesting the boy had died in an unreported workplace accident or an episode of domestic bowhan within the facility. However, a rigorous check of the structural records, interviews with the resident children, and eventual DNA profiling completely cleared the family of any direct or indirect involvement. Decades passed, and the case file grew into a massive collection of dead ends, transforming the unidentified victim into a symbolic entity known across the United States as America's unknown child. In the early 2000s, another compelling red herring briefly re-energized the stagnant ledger. A woman identified only as Martha came forward to investigators, delivering a highly detailed, harrowing narrative. She claimed her abusive mother had legally purchased the young boy from a transient family in 1954, subsequently confining him to a damp, unlit basement crawl space for several years. Martha stated that after a minor domestic incident, her mother had subjected the child to severe physical trauma, resulting in his immediate demise, before transporting his body in the trunk of their vehicle to the Susquehanna Road lot. The level of detail in her testimony perfectly mirrored several confidential aspects of the original crime scene report, sending a wave of cautious optimism through the homicide division. Yet, despite months of intensive tracking, detectives could find no physical corroboration. The family's historical residences yielded no matching biological traces, and neighbors from that era universally described Martha's mother as a quiet, eccentric woman with no unaccounted children. Ultimately, Martha's history of severe psychological instability and the complete lack of physical evidence forced the state to classify her statement as a tragic, deeply internalized delusion. The definitive turning point in the case did not occur through standard investigative legwork or the discovery of missing administrative files. It arrived through the revolutionary application of investigative genetic genealogy in the late 2010s. Realizing that traditional forensic methods had been completely exhausted, a new generation of cold case thamateur secured legal permission to exhume the child's remains from his resting place in Ivy Hill Cemetery. Specialized laboratory technicians extracted tiny, highly fragmented segments of degraded DNA from the inner structure of the boy's bone tissue. These segments were subjected to advanced deep sequencing technology, mapping the complete ancestral blueprint of the child. This genetic data was then uploaded to public genealogical registries, allowing computational algorithms to trace distant familial connections. For months, research teams meticulously charted a massive, labyrinthine family tree, navigating through thousands of historical birth certificates, marriage licenses, and immigration manifests. The digital branches slowly began to converge, narrowing the search field down to a specific maternal and paternal lineage rooted deeply within the historical working-class neighborhoods of mid-century Philadelphia. By late 2022, the genealogical mapping yielded a definitive result, officially restoring the name Joseph Augustus Sorelli to the historical record. But as detectives used this breakthrough to reconstruct the timeline of his life, the true, terrifying reality of the case began to materialize. upending over 60 years of traditional domestic abuse theories. When the original mid-century forensic files were re-examined alongside the newly uncovered family lineage, investigators looked closely at the anomalous, uniform smoothness of the boy's extremities that had puzzled the lab team decades prior. The reenactment of the timeline revealed that before Joseph succumbed to the final instance of blunt force trauma, his fingertips and toes had been systematically abraded and exposed to a calculated application of industrial-grade chemical acid. This was not the chaotic, panicked action of a stressed parent attempting to conceal an accidental injury in a moment of sudden anger. This was a highly cold, deliberate, and tactical procedure designed to permanently decouple the child from any medical or baptismal registries controlled by the state. The investigation revealed that Joseph was born into a family with deep covert ties to a highly structured, mid-century organized crime syndicate operating in Philadelphia. Within that criminal network, an unauthorized, unregistered child represented an extreme liability to the security and financial operations of the organization. The tactical erasure of his biological markers, the clean and calculated grooming of his hair, and the orderly placement of his remains within a standard retail box indicated a professional execution carried out to protect the identity of high-ranking actors within the syndicate. Joseph Augustus Zarelli no longer rests beneath a stone that marks him as an unknown entity. His headstone now displays his true name, his birth date, and his rightful place within the historical framework of the city. The resolution of his identity has completely shifted the focus of the Philadelphia Police Department, transforming a decades-old missing child case into an active, targeted homicide pursuit of the surviving remnants of the criminal network that ordered his erasure. The files remain open, the genetic leads are actively being traced through the descendants of that mid-century organization, and the state continues to narrow the gap between the secrets of the past and the final delivery of judicial accountability. While time can soften the immediate public memory of a historical tragedy, some secrets are structured so deeply into the landscape that they demand decades of advanced science just to unravel the truth, much like the complex, hidden histories that remain buried deep beneath our feet, waiting for the right moment to surface. While some of the most profound forensic mysteries are born from the dark intentions of organized syndicates, others are defined by a terrifying, absolute absence of physical traces. The transition from a highly calculated crime to a total vacuum of information often occurs in the most unassuming settings, moving away from the industrial core of historic coastal metropolises and settling directly into the quiet, sun-drenched suburbs of the American Midwest. In the early summer of 1992, the city of Springfield, Missouri, was the epitome of heartland security, a place where neighborhoods were structured around highly predictable routines, open front porches, and a collective belief that the dangers of the broader world were safely confined to distant state lines. Yet, it was within this exact fabric of suburban safety that an entire household would simply evaporate into thin air within a span of fewer than 4 hours, leaving behind an investigation that would ultimately become permanently encased beneath millions of dollars of municipal infrastructure. To understand the terrifying mechanics of the event, one must first look at the lives of the 3 individuals who inhabited that quiet pocket of Greene County. Cheryl Levitt was a 47-year-old single mother who had spent years establishing herself as a highly talented, deeply trusted hair artisan within the local community. Known for her meticulous attention to detail and her fiercely protective nature, Cheryl had recently achieved a significant personal milestone by purchasing a modest, single-story home on Delmar Street, a property she spent her limited free time completely remodeling with her own hands. Living with her was her 19-year-old daughter, Susie Streeter, a vibrant, popular young woman who had spent the early days of June preparing for her high school graduation alongside her lifelong best friend, Stacy McCall. Stacy, also 19, was an athletic, goal-oriented student who had already secured placement at a local university, her future mapped out with the precise, optimistic certainty unique to young adults standing on the precipice of independence. The bond between Susie and Stacy was exceptionally strong, characterized by shared social circles, identical summer plans, and a highly predictable patterns of constant communication that kept their respective families entirely connected. The evening of June 6, 1992, was intended to be a definitive celebration of these achievements. Susie and Stacy, having just walked across the stage to receive their high school diplomas, spent the late night hours attending a series of large graduation celebrations scattered across the Springfield area. The atmosphere across the city was one of collective relief and late-night revelry, with hundreds of young adults moving between various residential parties. Initially, the two young women had planned to spend the night at a local water park hotel complex where many of their classmates had secured rooms. However, as the early morning hours of June 7th began to approach, the girls adjusted their plans, communicating to friends that the hotel rooms had become overly crowded and loud. Seeking a quieter environment to rest before a planned trip to an amusement park the following morning, Susie and Stacy left the final party around 2 o'clock in the morning, operating Stacy's vehicle to navigate the short distance to Cheryl Levitt's home on Delmar Street. They arrived safely, parking their cars neatly in the driveway, completely unaware that the structural security of the home had already been compromised. The alarm was first raised not by local law enforcement, but by the frantic, highly intuitive actions of Janice McCall, Stacy's mother. By mid-morning on June 7th, Janice had attempted to contact the Delmar Street residents multiple times via telephone, seeking to confirm the timeline for her daughter's upcoming trip. Each attempt was met with a hollow, uninterrupted ringing that immediately triggered a deep sense of unease. Stacy was a young woman of absolute reliability, someone who never altered her schedule without delivering a direct notification to her family. Driven by a growing panic, Janice drove directly to the property, arriving shortly before noon. The scene that greeted her was superficially normal. Both Susie's and Stacy's vehicles were positioned in the driveway, their reflective surfaces gleaming under the bright summer sun. The front screen door was unlocked, swinging open with a gentle push. When Janice stepped over the threshold into the interior of the home, she entered a space that felt entirely frozen in time. The house was perfectly neat and orderly, showing zero signs of a violent struggle or a chaotic intrusion. On the kitchen counter, 3 purses were lined up in a precise, chilling row containing all identification cards, keys, personal checkbooks, and a substantial amount of cash. The family's small Yorkshire Terrier was pacing the living room floor, barking with a frantic, localized anxiety that suggested he had been left unattended for hours. In the bedrooms, the girls' clothing from the graduation parties was neatly folded or placed in laundry baskets, and their specialized prescription medications remained undisturbed on the side tables. The television set in the main bedroom was still operational, its screen humming with a heavy layer of static that cast an unnatural glow across the empty mattress. The only physical anomaly inside the pristine interior was the behavior of the telephone answering system, which Janice inadvertently cleared while attempting to search for clues, an act that would later become a source of profound frustration for forensic analysts. The absolute baseline of normality within the house made the total disappearance of Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy completely terrifying. It was as if they had been physically extracted from their lives in the middle of a mundane conversation. The responding tomter from the Springfield Police Department immediately recognized the extreme structural irregularities of the scene. A standard forensic canvas was deployed across the property, with technicians searching for any trace of forced entry, biological indicators, or foreign footprints. Outside on the concrete steps of the front porch, officers located the primary piece of physical evidence. The delicate glass globe designed to protect the porch light bulb had been completely shattered, its razor-sharp fragments scattered across the concrete walkway. Upon closer inspection, detectives noted that the bulb itself remained completely intact and operational, indicating that the breakage was not the result of a targeted act of vandalism or a structural failure, but rather a sudden, high-impact contact event that occurred in total darkness. The absence of blood spatter, scuff marks, or weapon fragments within the perimeter of the broken glass created an immediate logical contradiction. If a violent extraction had taken place on the front steps, it had been executed with an impossible level of speed and cleanliness. As news of the vanishing saturated the regional media markets, the investigation was quickly flooded with thousands of civilian tips, forcing law enforcement into a massive canvas of red herrings. The first major focus centered on a local labor worker who had been contracted to repair a concrete driveway on an adjacent property the previous afternoon. Multiple neighbors reported that the individual had exhibited highly aggressive, inappropriate tracking behavior towards Susie and Stacy as they prepared for their graduation ceremonies. Detectives tracked the man down, subjecting him to intensive psychological profiling and a rigorous review of his personal vehicular logs. While his historical background revealed a deeply problematic pattern of behavioral offenses, his timeline for the early morning hours of June 7th was ultimately verified by 3 independent witnesses, forcing the state to cross him off the priority registry. A second, highly sensationalized lead emerged when a regional tipster claimed to have witnessed a distinct, rusted commercial van operating with its headlights extinguished near Delmar Street around 3 o'clock in the morning. Police executed a massive sweep of all commercial vehicle registrations across 3 counties, processing dozens of identical vans, but every lead dissolved into a dead end, leaving investigators with an empty ledger and a community paralyzed by fear. The initial hypothesis of a voluntary disappearance or a localized runaway plot completely collapsed under the weight of the forensic evidence. None of the 3 women had touched their financial accounts, accessed public utility networks, or established communication with any known associates across the United States. Years bled into a cold, stagnant deadlock, with the case file transforming into a permanent testament to a flawless crime. The turning point did not emerge from a traditional prison informant or a sudden deathbed confession. It arrived over a decade later through a highly specialized audit of the historical communication logs belonging to the municipal utility and internal maintenance networks of the city. A dedicated data analyst, utilizing advanced digital recovery tools to process historical radio frequencies used by city operators during the early 90s, discovered an anomalous transmission that had been completely overlooked during the initial panic of 1992. The recording captured a highly specific anonymous whisper operating on an internal low-frequency band utilized exclusively by large-scale municipal construction crews. The voice, speaking with a cold, completely detached cadence, directed the listener away from the residential properties of Delmar Street and pointed directly toward a massive infrastructure project that had been underway during the exact week of the disappearances. According to the internal timeline log, a multi-million-dollar parking structure for a prominent regional clinical hospital was undergoing a continuous, high-volume concrete pour just 3 miles from the Levitt home. The anonymous transmission detailed specific coordinates within the deep subterranean structural columns of the garage, claiming that the physical remains of the 3 missing women had been introduced into the liquid matrix of the foundation immediately before the final layer of reinforced structural concrete was deployed by the engineering crews. Armed with this extraordinary diagnostic data, Cold Case Tom Tur and legal specialists immediately initiated the process to secure an execution warrant to perform deep core drilling and advanced ground-penetrating radar scans at the indicated hospital garage. Location. The investigative reasoning was clear. If the data was correct, the molecular variations within the structural columns would definitively reveal the presence of foreign biological mass trapped inside the solid granite matrix. However, as the legal paperwork began to navigate the complex bureaucratic channels of the state court system, the corporate development firm that controlled the hospital infrastructure intervened with an elite array of legal counsel. The firm presented complex architectural studies, arguing that any structural sampling or deep core drilling within the primary load-bearing columns would compromise the integrity of the entire multi-level clinical facility, representing a catastrophic safety risk to thousands of active medical patients. Before the detectives could overcome the legal injunctions and secure a modified search order, the construction timelines were rapidly accelerated. Within a matter of weeks, a massive, multi-tiered medical pavilion, valued at over $80 million, was aggressively erected directly over the contested foundation site, wrapping the target coordinates in thousands of additional tons of structural steel, heavy masonry, and high-density reinforced concrete. The rapid architectural completion created a permanent legal and physical deadlock. The state courts ultimately ruled that the anonymous utility transmission, while highly compelling, did not meet the strict threshold of probable cause required to authorize the partial demolition of a highly critical, operational public health care structure. The potential crime scene was effectively weaponized by corporate architecture, permanently entombed beneath the very matrix designed to heal the living. The Springfield Three remain a haunting fixture within the legal framework of Missouri, their names permanently etched onto missing persons registries that are updated with a heavy administrative regularity. The modest house on Delmar Street has changed hands multiple times over the decades, its interior walls repainted, and its broken porch light long since replaced, yet the property carries a distinct, lingering silence that causes local residents to step quickly past its boundary line. The true horror of the case rests not within the mysterious events of that early June morning, but within the physical landscape of Springfield itself. Every single day, thousands of hospital staff, medical patients, and oblivious visitors operate their motor vehicles across the smooth, multi-level tiers of that parking structure, completely unaware that the definitive answers to one of the country's most profound vanishings are locked seamlessly inside the dark, solid stone directly beneath their tires. The transition from life to total historical erasure was completed not by the passage of centuries, but by the cold, unyielding weight of concrete infrastructure, a structural monument to an unsolved tragedy that remains perfectly integrated into the daily flow of the modern world. The reliance on structural permanence and the heavy, unyielding security of contemporary architectural design often blinds the modern mind to how incredibly fragile domestic boundaries used to be. In the early decades of the 20th century, rural communities across the American heartland operated under an unspoken contract of total geographical trust. To explore this vulnerability, our path moves directly into the rolling agricultural landscapes of southwestern Iowa, settling into the prosperous, expanding town of Villisca in the year 1912. This was a community entirely structured around the rhythmic mechanics of the railroad industry, seasonal grain harvests, and a deeply localized network of family-owned businesses. Residents rarely utilized heavy security hardware or deadbolts. Locks were treated as superficial boundaries against the elements rather than protection against human malice. The home was viewed as a sanctuary of absolute transparency, an architectural extension of the community where doors remained unlatched and windows were left propped open to catch the cool summer night air. Yet, it was within this precise environment of absolute openness that an unknown entity would orchestrate an exercise in ritualistic violence so deeply calculated it would permanently freeze the town's development and remain an absolute deadlock in American criminal history. To fully understand the hidden mechanics of this case, one must look closely at the socio-economic framework of Villisca during the summer of 1912. The town's commercial center was dominated by Josiah Moore, a 39-year-old entrepreneur who had achieved massive financial success as the region's leading independent farm implement dealer. Josiah was the embodiment of Midwestern prosperity, charismatic, driven, and highly integrated into the governance of the local Presbyterian church. His wife, Sarah Moore, was recognized as a cornerstone of civic organization, managing a bustling, vibrant household that included their 4 young children, 11-year-old Herman, 9-year-old Catherine, 7-year-old Boyd, and 5-year-old Paul. The Moore residence was a prominent, multi-level frame structure positioned on a quiet residential street, an architectural symbol of the family's elevated status within the community. However, this commercial dominance had bred a silent, highly volatile undercurrent of economic friction. For years, Josiah had worked as the primary manager for Frank Jones, a powerful state senator who controlled the town's secondary commercial markets. When Josiah split away to establish his own independent firm, he took a substantial percentage of the regional clientele with him, triggering a cold, highly publicized business rivalry that divided the social allegiances of the town. The evening of Sunday, June 9, 1912, was characterized by a distinct, heavy heat that blanketed the county. The entire Moore family spent the late afternoon hours at the Presbyterian Church, participating in the annual Children's Day exercises, a highly anticipated community celebration featuring musical performances and scripture recitations coordinated by Sarah. Joining the Moore children were 2 young neighbor sisters, 12-year-old Lena Stillinger and her 8-year-old sister, Ina. The girls had traveled to Villisca for the weekend, and with the exercises concluding late into the evening, Sarah extended an invitation for them to spend the night at the Delmar Street home rather than navigating the dark rural roads back to their family property. The group left the church basement shortly after 9:30 in the evening, walking the short distance to the Moore home under a moonless, cloud-heavy sky. Neighbors later reported seeing the family walk up the front steps in a quiet, orderly fashion, their path illuminated only by the soft glow of localized gas street lamps. By 10 o'clock, the lights inside the frame house were methodically extinguished, settling the structure into the heavy, rural darkness of the Iowa plains. The first indication of a profound failure within the home occurred at 5 o'clock the following morning on Monday, June 10th. Mary Peckham, an elderly neighbor whose property sat directly adjacent to the Moore lot, stepped onto her porch to initiate her morning chores. She noted with immediate unease that the Moore house remained entirely dark, its heavy shades drawn completely down to the windowsills. This was an extreme deviation from the family's rigid agricultural routine. Josiah was universally known to emerge by dawn to manage his commercial showroom, and the 4 young children were typically audible across the yard by early morning. Mary approached the back door, knocking firmly against the screen, but was met only with a hollow, suffocating silence from the interior compartments. When she attempted to peer through the glass kitchen window, she noted that the internal layout was entirely obscured by heavy cloths draped over the frames. Growing increasingly alarmed, Mary contacted Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, requesting that he travel to the property to perform a structural welfare check. Ross arrived at the property shortly before 7 in the morning, operating a spare key to open the front door. The moment the lock turned, he was met by an atmosphere that felt completely stagnant, heavy with the metallic tang of iron and the distinct cloying scent of unrefined lamp oil. Navigating in the dim light, Ross stepped into the downstairs guest bedroom where Lena and Ina Stillinger had been assigned to sleep. The room was shrouded in total darkness, the windows completely covered with dark dress fabric pulled from the closet. As his eyes adjusted to the shadows, he pulled back a corner of the blanket and discovered the young sisters resting motionless on the mattress, their forms exhibiting the undeniable signatures of massive, repetitive blunt force trauma to the cranial structure. Ross fled the home, screaming for medical assistance and triggering an immediate, chaotic convergence of local townspeople and regional law enforcement officers onto the property. The initial response by the municipal authorities was characterized by an absolute absence of contemporary forensic discipline. Before a proper perimeter could be established, hundreds of curious citizens, journalists, and amateur trackers trampled across the lot, completely destroying any foreign footprints, vehicular tracks, or external biological material. When the county coroner and medical examiners finally stabilized the interior space, they discovered that the scope of the violence extended across every single bed in the house. All 8 occupants, 2 adults and 6 children, had been systematically attacked while sleeping, suffering catastrophic blunt force trauma executed with extreme uniform physics. The weapon utilized in the attacks was discovered in the downstairs bedroom, a heavy, blood-stained, conventional chopping axe belonging to Josiah himself, which had been retrieved from a storage niche near the back porch. The medical examiners determined that the time of death for all 8 victims sat between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning, indicating the entire operation had been completed in absolute silence without alerting a single neighbor. As the absolute horror of the event paralyzed southwestern Iowa, the investigation quickly dissolved into a massive maze of conflicting testimonies and sensationalized red herrings. The dominant public theory focused entirely on the economic rivalry between Josiah Moore and Senator Frank Jones. Rumors swept the state that Jones had utilized his immense financial resources to hire an external executioner named William Mansfield, a known transient construction worker with a highly problematic history of violence across the Midwest. Private detectives pored over Mansfield's structural logs, attempting to link his train travels to the Villisca Station infrastructure on the night of June 9th. Despite months of aggressive public accusations and a highly publicized grand jury investigation that pushed the town to the brink of open civil conflict, forensic analysis could find no physical link matching Mansfield to the scene, and his employment records delivered a verified, airtight alibi 300 miles away, forcing the state to abandon the hypothesis. A secondary, highly disturbing red herring emerged in the form of Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly, a traveling Presbyterian minister who had been present at the Children's Day exercises on the night of the murders. Kelly was a highly eccentric, deeply volatile individual who suffered from severe, documented psychological instability. Witnesses emerged claiming that Kelly had boarded a outbound train from the Villisca station at 5 o'clock on Monday morning, openly discussing the details of an axe slaughter before the bodies had even been officially discovered by Ross Moore. Furthermore, investigators discovered that Kelly had sent a dress shirt to a regional laundry facility that was heavily contaminated with distinct bloodstains. The state arrested the minister, subjecting him to multiple intense interrogations where he delivered a series of erratic, highly theatrical confessions mixed with scriptural text. However, during his high-profile trial, advanced medical evaluation revealed that his confessions were the direct output of severe delusion, and the blood on his garments was verified to be non-human in origin. Kelly was ultimately acquitted, leaving the state's legal ledger completely empty and the investigation deadlocked. The true turning point in the case did not arrive through the pursuit of local suspects or the analysis of train manifests. It occurred when a specialized team of private forensic investigators, operating outside the political influence of the town council, decided to ignore the superficial chaos of the legal testimony and focus entirely on the cold, immutable physical physics of the crime scene itself. They initiated a meticulous structural mapping of the house, treating the building as a localized diagnostic container. As they analyzed the directionality of the blood spatter and the precise impact markers left on the wooden walls, they realized that the perpetrator had possessed an impossible, intimate knowledge of the home's layout, the sleeping locations of every child, and the exact creaks engineered into the old floorboards. The investigators realized they were not dealing with a chaotic, random drifter, but an individual who had spent an extensive amount of time conducting a terrifying exercise in structural surveillance from within the building itself. As the forensic specialists moved up the narrow staircase to inspect the dark, isolated attic space directly above the master bedroom, the true, deeply unsettling reality of the architecture began to materialize. Deep within the crawl space, where the floorboards met the thick layers of wool and sawdust insulation, investigators located two distinct physical signatures. The insulation had been systematically hollowed out, creating a functional, long-term nesting depression where an individual could lie prone for hours without making a sound. Directly adjacent to this nesting zone, the wood of the ceiling plaster had been carefully gouged out from above, creating a small, functional borehole that looked down with absolute geometric precision onto the mattress where Josiah and Sarah Moore slept. The reenactment of the true timeline revealed a sequence that sent a wave of absolute horror through the state. The perpetrator had entered the Moore residence hours before the family returned from the church exercises, slipping through an unsecured rear door during the afternoon transition. The killer had crawled into the darkness of the attic, carrying a small array of tools and an absolute frozen patience. For hours, while the house sat empty, the individual lay prone in the insulation, utilizing the borehole to monitor the baseline acoustics of the home. When the family finally returned at 10 o'clock, laughing and preparing the children for bed, the killer remained directly above them, listening to the intimate noises of their domestic routine. The perpetrator waited in total darkness for over 4 hours after the lights were extinguished, ensuring the family had settled into the deepest stages of physiological sleep. Moving with an impossible, practiced fluid motion, the killer descended the stairs in stocking feet, bypassing every creaking board based on his prior structural mapping. He retrieved the axe from the back porch, systematically removed the protective glass chimney from an oil lamp to minimize any reflective light, and executed the 8 occupants in a calculated sequence that prevented a single scream from traveling past the walls. After completing the axe, the killer did not panic. He spent several hours inside the bloodstained structure, using garments pulled from the dressers to meticulously cover every mirror and reflective glass surface in the house, an act legal psychologists define as a ritualistic attempt to visually close the architectural space against the gaze of the dead. Before slipping away into the pre-dawn fog, the perpetrator placed a wrapped 2-pound slab of commercial bacon neatly next to the Dean Ma weapon, a final, unexplainable signature that suggested a deeply disturbed symbolic motivation completely detached from standard criminal focus. The Villisca axe murders remain one of the most profound, legally deadlocked mysteries in the history of American jurisprudence. The frame house on Del Mar Street still stands, its historical architecture perfectly preserved as a dark monument to a night when the unspoken contract of rural security was completely shattered. The town of Villisca never fully recovered from the internal paranoia bred by the investigation. The population stagnated, and the economic prosperity of the early 20th century slowly dissolved into the surrounding cornfields. The true lingering horror of the case resides in the chilling reality of its spatial design. It forces a complete reconsideration of the spaces we inhabit, reminding us that the ultimate danger is not always an external force breaking through a locked perimeter, but can sometimes be an entity that has already found its way inside, waiting quietly in the absolute darkness directly above your head for the lights to go out. The cold stillness of the Iowa plains offers no further answers, its heavy timber holding the secrets of 1912 in a permanent grip, much like the silent, shifting currents of our next destination. where an entire ship's crew would be discovered frozen in a state of absolute terror under a blazing tropical sun. The strategic shipping lanes of the post-war world often baseline their safety on the absolute predictability of global communication networks and international maritime registration. In the years immediately following the conclusion of the Second World War, the maritime passages of Southeast Asia, particularly the narrow choke point known as the Strait of Malacca, were filled with a high volume of commercial traffic. Thousands of merchant vessels, surplus military freighters, and undocumented cargo ships navigated these tropical waters, transporting the materials required to rebuild a devastated global economy. Amid this rapid surge in maritime commerce, the regulatory frameworks managed by traditional naval authorities struggled to maintain absolute oversight. The vast space of the ocean, combined with the chaotic shifting of post-war borders, created an environment where a ship could slip between ports under falsified registries, carrying cargo that existed entirely outside the legal manifests controlled by sovereign nations. It was a landscape where a massive steel hull could operate within sight of major coastal listening stations, yet remain completely hidden from the official ledgers of the world. To fully map the structural parameters of this maritime anomaly, one must look closely at the operational routine of the Silver Star, an experienced American merchant vessel navigating the warm currents of the strait in the winter of 1947. The ship was staffed by a highly disciplined crew, accustomed to the predictable mechanical physics of ocean transit, the steady thrum of the engine rooms, the regular rotation of the bridge watches, and the constant monitoring of high-frequency wireless bands. The atmosphere on board was one of standard commercial isolation, with the horizon offering nothing but a uniform expanse of water under a heavy, humid sky. The temperature in the region was consistently oppressive, with the tropical sun beating down on the steel decks, raising external surfaces to well over 32 degrees Celsius, and creating a shimmering heat mirage that distorted the boundary between the sea and the sky. The fragile baseline of this mechanical routine completely fractured during the afternoon watch when the Silver Star's primary wireless monitoring station picked up an erratic series of distress signals broadcast on the international distress frequency. The transmission was not the standard structured request for navigational assistance or mechanical towing. It was a fragmented, highly volatile sequence of Morse code dots and dashes that bypassed the standard protocol of maritime signaling. The wireless operator on the Silver Star, along with listening monitors at multiple coastal stations in British Malaya and Sumatra, copied down a transmission that felt immediately hollow and unaligned with standard emergency traffic. The code spelled out a frantic, clear declaration. All officers, including captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge, probably whole crew dead. This was followed by a long, erratic sequence of meaningless characters as if a hand were resting heavily on the transmitting key before a final definitive phrase cut through the static, "I die." Then, the frequency fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. The captain of the Silver Star utilized basic radio direction finding triangulation to plot the exact coordinates of the mysterious broadcast, altering his ship's course to intercept the target position. After several hours of aggressive steam navigation through the heavy swells of the strait, the lookout spotted a large, dark silhouette drifting aimlessly on the horizon. As the distance closed, the vessel was officially identified as the Orang Medan, a conventional Dutch-registered cargo freighter. The ship exhibited an absolute absence of operational life. No smoke emerged from its massive funnels, its mechanical steering apparatus was entirely unresponsive, and no flags were displayed along its rigging. The vessel rolled lazily with the ocean currents, its steel framework appearing entirely intact, showing zero signs of an external collision, structural failure, or an active onboard fire. The captain ordered the deployment of a specialized tactical boarding party tasked with crossing the rolling water in a small lifeboat to perform a welfare check and determine the nature of the emergency. As the oars rhythmically struck the water, the rescue team noted that the air surrounding the drifting freighter felt strangely static, devoid of the standard sea breeze that typically cut through the heat of the strait. They approached the rusted iron hull, securing their lines to the companionway ladder, and stepped onto the main deck of the Orang Medan. The moment their boots touched the steel plates, the rescuers entered a space that felt entirely disconnected from the active commerce of the shipping lanes. The silence on deck was absolute, heavy, and immediate, punctuated only by the low, hollow groaning of the ship's bulkhead shifting against the ocean swell. The boarding party initiated a structured room-by-room canvass of the upper decks, and they were immediately confronted by a human layout that defied every established doctrine of maritime disaster. Distributed across the open deck plates were the remains of the crew members, all lying on their backs with their faces directed squarely toward the blazing tropical sun. The rescuers encountered various immediate red herrings as they mapped the positions of the deceased. The first logical assumption was a highly targeted, violent pirate raid, a common security risk within the narrow channels of the strait. However, a close forensic inspection of the deck area completely eliminated this hypothesis. There was an absolute absence of blood spatter, structural damage from ballistic weapons, or any signs of a physical hand-to-hand struggle. Furthermore, the ship's secure storage safes remained locked and undisturbed, and the personal valuables of the crew were still resting in their pockets, completely contradicting the financial motivations of an ocean raid. A second theory emerged, focusing on a mass mutiny among the lower deck laborers against the command structure. Yet, as the rescue team moved toward the bridge, they found that the operational personnel and the deckhands had perished simultaneously in their exact duty stations, their bodies showing zero defensive wounds or signs of internal conflict. The turning point of the structural investigation occurred when the team leader opened the heavy steel door leading into the interior wheelhouse and chart room compartments. As the rescue team stepped over the coaming into the enclosed spaces, they hit a profound physical anomaly that shattered every remaining medical and mechanical hypothesis. While the exterior deck plates were radiating intense heat from the 32-degree tropical sun, the interior corridors of the Orang Medan had undergone a radical, impossible temperature drop. The air inside the steel bulkheads was at a bone-chilling, winter-like freezing point. The rescuers' breath instantly plumed into thick white clouds in the darkness, and a thin layer of unnatural frost was visible along the brass instruments of the navigation console. The sudden environmental transition inside the closed container of the hull indicated that whatever had transpired within the ship was completely decoupled from the normal physics of the surrounding region. The rescue party used their high-powered flashlights to cut through the freezing shadows of the wheelhouse, mapping the final positions of the command staff. The captain was found slumped over the edge of the primary bridge railing, his form entirely rigid. Nearby, the communications officer remained seated at his wireless desk, his fingers still resting directly adjacent to the transmitting apparatus that had broadcast the final Morse code message hours prior. As the boarding team conducted a detailed forensic analysis of the corpses, they noted a chilling, absolutely uniform physical presentation across every single individual, including the ship's mascot dog found frozen on the deck plates. There was an absolute lack of physical trauma, fractures, or blunt force injuries on any of the remains. Instead, every body was locked into a state of extreme muscular contraction, their arms extended rigidly forward, clawing at the empty space directly above them. Their mouths were gaping wide, and their eyes were wide open, staring with an expression of absolute, unadulterated terror at a point in space that was completely empty. The medical and structural reasoning process of the rescuers shifted toward an invisible environmental casualty. The uniform masks of terror and the rigid, clawing contortions suggested a sudden, catastrophic failure of the respiratory system, likely resulting from the rapid release of a highly toxic neuromuscular agent. Reenacting the final timeline of the freighter, based on the spatial distribution of the bodies, investigators later hypothesized that the Orang Medan was engaged in the illicit, highly classified transport of unregistered chemical compounds, specifically high-volume canisters of potassium cyanide and unstable military-grade nitroglycerin left over from wartime laboratories. The structural reconstruction of the failure suggests that ocean water had slowly leaked into the lower hold, interacting with the chemical matrix of the cargo to trigger a massive, rapid off-gassing of lethal, invisible fume. This toxic vapor would have risen through the ventilation shafts of the ship, causing instant asphyxiation and rapid neuromuscular arrest across the entire crew before they could execute emergency procedures. The extreme, localized freezing point inside the interior compartments was explained as the thermodynamic byproduct of a massive, rapid chemical vaporization event occurring within the closed steel container of the lower cargo holds, a physics phenomenon that effectively transformed the interior of the ship into a massive refrigeration vault of the dead. The boarding team realized that the interior compartments represented an extreme biological risk to their own safety, and the temperature anomaly was beginning to fluctuate erratically. The leader ordered an immediate withdrawal from the interior structure, returning to the main deck to coordinate the attachment of a heavy towing cable to salvage the vessel for a comprehensive forensic autopsy at a secure naval port. However, before the lines could be secured to the Silver Star's winches, a sharp metallic pressure wave traveled up through the deck plates of the Dutch freighter. A low, rumbling vibration emerged from the number 4 cargo hatch, followed immediately by a dense, unexplainable plume of white chemical smoke that began to saturate the air. Recognizing the signs of an imminent structural explosion within the lower holds, the rescue crew abandoned their salvage equipment, scrambling down the companionway ladder to their lifeboat and pulling hard across the swell to return to the safety of the Silver Star. They had cleared the area by only a few hundred meters when the lower hull of the Orang Medan erupted into a spectacular silent chain of explosions. The force of the detonation did not create a massive firestorm. Instead, it pulverized the internal load-bearing bulkheads of the freighter, causing the massive steel ship to lift its stern vertically into the air before plunging rapidly into the deep ocean trenches of the strait. Within less than 10 minutes, the entire vessel had vanished beneath the shifting currents, taking every physical answer and every frozen witness down into an absolute deep-sea grave. The sinking of the Orang Medan represents one of the most thoroughly managed deadlocks in contemporary maritime history. For decades, official naval registries and government entities across Europe and the United States maintained a stance of absolute administrative silence regarding the incident, often classifying the ship's very existence as an unverified maritime legend to prevent public inquiry into post-war chemical shipping networks. No official insurance claims were ever settled, and no families received formal casualty reports from the state. The true, lingering horror of the case resides entirely within the absolute cleanliness of its erasure. The rapid chemical failure and subsequent structural collapse of the ship ensured that the physical environment itself acted as the ultimate cleanup mechanism, leaving behind an empty expanse of water that looks entirely identical to any other point on the global trade maps. The secrets of the freighter remain locked inside a crushed steel envelope kilometers beneath the shipping lanes, a permanent reminder that the vast patterns of global commerce are constantly operating directly over the top of profound, frozen tragedies that the modern world has collectively chosen to forget, much like the dark, hidden paths of our next destination, where a pristine winter landscape would become the tracking field for a series of impossible, bipedal prints that defied the known limits of biological reality. The comforting familiarity of local folklore often serves as a protective psychological layer, a sanitized mechanism that allows communities to convert their deepest, most visceral fears into harmless campfire stories. When a narrative becomes a standard urban legend, passed down through generations of teenagers, the real-world historical textures are almost entirely erased, leaving behind a cartoonish myth designed to elicit safe, predictable thrills. To fully map this transformation, our path takes us directly into the crisp, autumn landscapes of Northern Virginia, settling into the rural, heavily forested boundaries of Fairfax County and the small enclave of Clifton in the year 1970. During this specific era, the entire region was experiencing a profound structural shift. The ancient, rolling dairy farms and historic logging tracts that had defined the landscape since the 19th century were being aggressively swallowed by a massive wave of post-war suburban development. Asphalt highways were being carved through pristine timberlands, and newly framed master-planned subdivisions were creeping toward the dark, isolated hollows of the countryside. This demographic collision created a distinct, lingering tension, a world where the bright, sterile security of modern suburbia stood within arm's reach of deeply isolated prehistoric wilderness spaces that had never been truly tamed by the state. At the absolute center of this geographical friction sat Colchester Road, a narrow, unlit strip of asphalt that cut a winding path through the dense secondary growth oak and pine forests of Clifton. The road was universally known for a specific architectural feature: a historic, single-lane railway overpass constructed from massive blocks of dark, hand-hewn granite, engineered during the mid-19th century to allow steam locomotives to cross the rugged Virginia watershed. By the winter of 1970, the bridge had become a total vacuum of light after sunset. its deep stone archway casting a permanent, heavy shadow over the roadway below. Because of its absolute isolation from the developing municipal core, the area around the overpass had become a highly predictable nighttime sanctuary for local high school students and young couples seeking privacy away from the watchful eyes of their newly established suburban communities. They would operate their motor vehicles down the winding curves of Colchester Road, cut the engines beneath or near the stone bridge, and sit in the heavy, silent darkness of the timber, completely oblivious to the fact that the baseline security of their rural sanctuary was about to be completely upended by an entity that defied every conventional standard of criminal pathology. The first official record of a failure within the perimeter of Colchester Road emerged during the late evening hours of October 19, 1970. A young couple, having completed an evening drive through the county, parked their conventional sedan in a small dirt turnoff approximately 30 meters from the granite face of the overpass. The night air was exceptionally still and cold, causing a thick layer of condensation to form along the glass windows of the vehicle, completely obscuring their view of the surrounding tree line. Suddenly, the fragile silence inside the passenger compartment was shattered by a sudden, violent movement along the passenger side exterior mirror. Before either individual could adjust their focus, a highly anomalous silhouette materialized directly out of the heavy brush. Standing adjacent to the door was a figure clad entirely in an absolute pristine white bodysuit that appeared to replicate a stylized rabbit, complete with large, rigid ears extending high above the frame. Before the occupants could process the utter absurdity of the visual display, the figure's posture shifted into one of absolute, aggressive physical threat. The entity raised a heavy metal chopping hatchet high above its head, screamed a series of frantic, distorted warnings regarding immediate trespassing on private soil, and brought the weapon down with immense velocity, completely pulverizing the safety glass of the passenger window. The driver, acting on pure survival adrenaline, slammed the vehicle into gear and accelerated aggressively down the winding curves of Colchester Road, the tires screaming for traction across the loose asphalt. They did not stop until they reached a brightly lit public telephone pavilion, where they contacted the Fairfax County Police Department in a state of absolute psychological shock. Within less than 10 days, while detectives were still attempting to categorize the structural irregularities of the initial report, a second identical ambush occurred along the exact same baseline. A private security guard tasked with monitoring a newly framed construction site near the perimeter of the historic overpass was completing his midnight patrol when a matching white silhouette emerged cleanly from the timber. The figure was operating a full-sized felling axe, swinging the heavy iron head with absolute precision to shatter the wooden support pillars of a temporary guard station before vanishing into the thick underbrush without leaving a single vocal footprint. The rapid succession of these two highly bizarre, visually distinct assaults triggered an immediate viral wave of panic across the local schools and subdivisions, birthing the initial framework of what the regional media markets would quickly name the Bunnyman of Clifton Bridge. The responding Tom Turr launched a massive, resource-heavy canvass of the entire Clifton watershed, treating the incidents as a highly volatile series of localized assaults. As they analyzed the scene metrics, multiple illogical elements completely frustrated the standard profiling methods of the department. The most profound contradiction was the condition of the physical costume itself. Both independent victim groups universally emphasized that despite the thick autumn mud, heavy briar patches, and dense, unmanaged underbrush that characterized the woods of Fairfax County, the white fabric of the attacker's suit remained completely spotless, gleaming under the moonlight without a single trace of earth or organic tearing. This detail indicated an impossible level of careful, engineered maintenance, completely unaligned with the behavior of a chaotic, transient madman living rough in the wilderness. Police followed a flurry of red herrings, focusing heavily on an eccentric local teenager who possessed a history of severe behavioral disturbances and a documented fascination with regional historical folklore. Surveillance teams monitored his movements for over 72 hours, but advanced alibi verification placed him miles away under parental supervision during both ambush windows. A secondary lead emerged when regional treatment facilities reported the unauthorized departure of a transient patient with a history of manic instability, but a rigorous tracking operation located the individual in a neighboring state, completely empty of any connection to Clifton, leaving the police ledger deadlocked and the community paralyzed by an invisible fear. The definitive turning point in the case did not occur through a direct physical arrest, a vehicular intercept, or the discovery of the pristine white suit in a residential basement. It arrived through a deeply disturbing, purely ecological discovery made deep within the restricted boundaries of the county forest preserve, more than 2 kilometers away from the granite face of the overpass. In the early morning hours of November 12, 1970, a specialized team of state forest rangers was executing a routine wildlife survey through an unmapped, densely timbered ravine that had remained completely untouched by the surrounding suburban construction. As the rangers navigated through a heavy thicket of old-growth oak trees, they noticed a profound, unnatural failure in the surrounding environment. The standard vocalizations of regional birds and small mammals had completely ceased, replaced by a suffocating, absolute silence. More alarming, however, was a distinct, cloying scent of organic decay drifting cleanly on the cold morning breeze, a scent that felt immediately dense and unaligned with the natural life cycles of the forest. The rangers traced the olfactory line down into the absolute center of a small hidden clearing, and the scene that materialized before them completely shattered the standard operational parameters of the County Forestry Service. Suspended high within the upper branches of a massive dead oak tree were dozens of wild rabbits, their physical remains meticulously arranged in a chinte, geometric circle that formed an intentional structural pattern across the wood. The animals had been systematically stripped of their hides, their bodies pale and skeletal against the dark bark of the tree. What caused an immediate wave of absolute horror to cascade through the tracking party, however, was the method of their suspension. The individual had utilized thick, industrial-grade barbed wire, wrapping the rusted metal coils with extreme physical force around the upper branches to ensure the display remained permanently fixed against the sky. The sheer numbers of the carcasses, totaling more than 40 distinct specimens, indicated an extensive, long-term operation that had been carried out over the course of several months in total secrecy, directly adjacent to the developing residential neighborhoods of Clifton. The county authorities immediately secured the clearing, deploying a specialized veterinary pathologist and state forensic medical examiners to perform detailed autopsy results on the animal remains. The scientific reasoning process was focused on a single critical metric, determining the exact physics used to complete the skinning process. The initial public profile of the Bunny Man suggested a crude, chaotic lunatic hacking at targets with a heavy axe in a state of manic rage. However, when the laboratory analysis of the tissue was completed, that hypothesis completely collapsed. The autopsy results revealed that the incisions across the limbs and torsos of the rabbits were entirely uniform, clean, and executed with a professional medical-grade scalpel. There was an absolute absence of ragged tearing, bone fractures, or erratic tool slips. The tissue had been parted with absolute clinical precision, demonstrating an advanced, intimate familiarity with comparative anatomy, surgical technique, or veterinary medicine. The reenactment of the true criminal timeline revealed a reality that was infinitely more terrifying than any localized campfire myth. The perpetrator was not an escaped asylum patient or a simple teenage prankster operating out of boredom. He was a highly calculated, deeply structured actor, likely a trained medical professional, researcher, or surgical student who was actively utilizing the dense timber of Clifton as a private pathology laboratory to fulfill a dark psychological fixation. The reenactment demonstrated that the ridiculous, cartoonish persona of an axe-wielding figure in a giant white rabbit costume was not a manifestation of madness, but a deliberately engineered psychological smokescreen. The individual understood that Northern Virginia's rapid suburban expansion would inevitably bring citizens into contact with his hidden clearing deeper in the woods. By creating a loud, terrifying, and fundamentally absurd urban legend at the stone overpass, he guaranteed that any civilian who witnessed a strange white silhouette near Colchester Road would immediately flee in a state of panic, attributing the encounter to a myth rather than investigating the deep woods where his true, clinical experimentation was being executed. The spotless cleanliness of his costume was maintained because he operated inside a clean, structured laboratory environment within his own residence, utilizing the suit exclusively as a psychological weapon to patrol the perimeter of his real-world laboratory space. The investigation into the Bunny Man of Clifton Bridge ultimately dissolved into a permanent administrative deadlock. As the severe winter freezes of late 1970 settled over Fairfax County, the localized ambushes beneath the granite bridge abruptly ceased, and the spotting of the white silhouette vanished from the official police ledgers. Despite decades of advanced forensic auditing, tracking through regional medical schools, and crossing-checking licensing registries for specialized surgical scalpels, no individual was ever officially indicted for the assaults or the ecological horrors hidden within the ravine. The legal files were eventually transferred into the silent, deep archives of the State Cold Case Division, heavily protected from public display, to prevent a widespread crisis of confidence across the newly established, wealthy subdivisions of Northern Virginia. The sanitized urban legend survived, transformed by the passage of time into a safe, generational rite of passage for local teenagers who still gather beneath the dark archway of Colchester Road on Halloween night, completely oblivious to the cold, historical reality of the case. The true, lingering horror of the Clifton Overpass rests entirely within the design of its surrounding landscape. It stands as a silent warning that the clean, well-lit safety of contemporary suburbia is often separated from absolute clinical depravity by nothing more than a thin line of timber. The granite blocks of the old railway bridge remain entirely unchanged, their dark surfaces casting the same deep shadow over the road as they did over 50 years ago, a physical monument to a perpetrator who successfully weaponized human folklore to protect a terrifying secret hidden deep within the woods, much like the claustrophobic granite vaults of our next destination, where the physical boundaries of a mountain would seal 13 workers inside a living tomb, forcing them to spend their final days trapped between the rhythmic sounds of life on the upper tiers and the absolute silence of the deep earth below. The mechanical transformation of the American landscape during the peak of the Industrial Revolution often relied on an absolute, unwavering confidence in mathematical calculations and engineering projections. During the mid-19th century, the expanding rail networks of New England faced a massive, seemingly insurmountable geographical barrier in western Massachusetts, the Berkshires, specifically the ancient, solid granite wall of Hoosac Mountain. To establish a direct trade corridor between Boston and the expanding markets of the Midwest, corporate directors and state planners authorized an elite engineering project of unprecedented scale. Beginning in 1851, operations commenced to carve a continuous 7-kilometer subterranean passage directly through the mountain core. The project became an absolute magnet for engineering innovation, serving as the real-world testing ground for the world's first pneumatic rock drills, massive, custom-engineered boring machines, and highly volatile chemical blasting agents. However, the absolute isolation of the subsurface environment, combined with the primitive state of mid-19th century industrial safety protocols, transformed this engineering triumph into a massive engine of human attrition, claiming the lives of at least 193 workers over a span of 24 years and earning the permanent, terrifying historical moniker of the Bloody Pit. To fully map the structural parameters of this industrial tragedy, one must look closely at the operational layout established near the rural township of Florida, Massachusetts, in the late 1860s 67. The centerpiece of the entire project was the central ventilation shaft, a massive, vertically engineered stone cylinder designed to plunge over 250 feet from the mountain crest directly down into the absolute center of the horizontal rail path. This shaft was a critical structural lungs for the entire operation, designed to allow the toxic smoke, explosive gases, and heavy dust from the continuous blasting work to escape into the atmosphere. Managing the top of this vertical pipeline was an intricate array of heavy industrial infrastructure, including a massive wooden hoisting house, coal-fired pumping engines, and a localized gas manufacturing plant that illuminated the subterranean worksites below. The labor force was structured around highly disciplined shifts of miners, consisting heavily of newly arrived immigrants and experienced mountain engineers who operated under a continuous, high-volume production schedule, completely isolated from the standard rhythms of the daylight world above. The fragile baseline of this mechanical operation completely fractured on the warm afternoon of October 19, 1867. Deep within the lower tiers of the central shaft, a specialized team of 13 miners was completing a standard drilling cycle, their pneumatic equipment hammering rhythmically against the dense granite face. Directly above them, at the surface landing of the shaft, an unstable pipeline routing highly flammable naphtha gas to the manufacturing generator experienced a sudden, catastrophic structural failure. A loose spark from a coal furnace instantly ignited the vapor matrix, triggering a massive, low-frequency explosion that tore through the upper hoisting works. Within less than 30 seconds, the entire wooden superstructure was completely pulverized, collapsing into a violent, localized firestorm. The heavy timber beams, massive iron gears, and burning coal reserves plunged down the vertical throat of the shaft, forming a dense, flaming plug of industrial debris that completely sealed the 13 miners away from the surface world. The municipal response and corporate evaluation of the incident were immediate, shifting rapidly into a process of clinical calculation managed by the project's chief engineers and state directors. As smoke poured from the mountain crest, rescue teams attempted to look down the vertical pipeline, but were met only with a pitch-black column of toxic fumes, intense heat waves, and the continuous sound of secondary rock collapses deep within the structure. The engineering command structure initiated a rigorous diagnostic analysis of the environment below, calculating the total volume of oxygen present within the sealed subterranean chamber against the metabolic consumption rate of 13 adult males. The mathematical models utilized by the company delivered a stark, definitive projection. Given the intense fire consuming the upper timber plug, the available air supply would be completely exhausted within less than 45 minutes, resulting in rapid carbon monoxide poisoning and absolute asphyxiation for any individual trapped below. Acting on these clinical projections, corporate management declared the situation a total loss, instructing the pump crews to completely deactivate the surface ventilation fans and suspend all rescue operations for a full calendar year to focus on structural stabilization and the clearing of the massive physical wreckage. During the extensive 12-month interim, the investigation into the disaster became deadlocked within a maze of corporate red herrings and conflicting public testimonies. The primary legal strategy deployed by the railroad directors focused heavily on downplaying the disaster, presenting detailed internal engineering logs to argue that a rare, unpreventable pocket of native methane gas within the Granite Mountain had triggered the explosion, completely absolving the firm of maintenance negligence. A secondary, highly publicized red herring emerged when regional journalists published sensationalized interviews with local mountain residents who claimed to have witnessed signs of internal sabotage, suggesting that a rival transport conglomerate had intentionally compromised the naphtha lines to delay the completion of the tunnel. State authorities spent months tracking down transient laborers and checking warehouse manifests for illicit explosives, but every lead dissolved into a dead end, leaving the public ledger stagnant and the families of the 13 miners paralyzed by an absolute, heavy lack of closure. The definitive turning point in the case did not occur through a sudden corporate confession or the discovery of missing maintenance files. It arrived exactly 1 year later, in October of 1868, when massive, custom-built steam pump arrays finally completed the clearance of the waterlog and debris layers from the central ventilation shaft. A specialized recovery team, accompanied by a county medical examiner, was lowered down the vertical cylinder in a reinforced iron cage, expecting to retrieve nothing but baseline biological remains and scattered skeletal debris that had been subjected to intense heat and a full year of water submersion. As the cage touched the absolute floor of the horizontal rail tier, the tracking team illuminated their high-powered lanterns, stepping into a space that felt entirely frozen in time. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and stagnant lime, but the physical environment showed an impossible level of careful, post-blast order that completely invalidated every mathematical calculation the corporate directors had presented to the state. As the doctors and investigators mapped the interior boundaries of the lower chamber, the true, deeply unsettling reality of the tragedy began to materialize before them, upending 12 months of official administrative projections. Tucked away from the blast zone, behind a massive protective bulkhead of hand-stacked granite blocks, lay a clean, completely organized survival encampment. The 13 miners had not died within 45 minutes of the blast. The forensic examination of the scene revealed that the men had survived the initial explosion completely unharmed, utilizing their specialized blasting timber to construct a functional, sturdy wooden raft that kept them safely elevated above the toxic, rising subterranean groundwater that filled the shaft floor. Resting neatly on the timbers of the raft were a series of leather pocket journals belonging to the shift managers. As the investigators parted the water-damaged pages, the true timeline of their final days was laid bare in meticulous, handwritten prose. The journals detailed that for over 5 full days following the explosion at the surface, the 13 men had lived in a state of absolute, clear mental clarity. Because the corporate management had ordered the deactivation of the primary ventilation fans, the air inside the chamber had slowly, methodically stratified, trapping the miners in a dwindling pocket of oxygen near the ceiling. The reenactment of their final hours revealed an exercise in psychological torment that defied every standard of industrial horror. The shift logs recorded that the men sat in absolute darkness, their tracking watches rhythmically ticking away the hours, while the sound of normal shift work on the upper mountain tiers vibrated cleanly through the solid granite rock directly above their heads. Due to the unique acoustic physics of the dense mountain architecture, the 13 miners could hear the distant, muffled voices and heavy iron hammers of the clearing crews working to repair the hoisting house, yet the immense density of the 250 feet of stone completely prevented their own desperate screams and rhythmic tool taps from ever reaching the surface. The journals described a sequence where one by one, the men calmly completed their final messages to their families, laid down in an orderly row upon the wooden planks of the raft, and succumbed to slow, painless asphyxiation as the carbon dioxide levels reached an absolute, critical saturation point. The recovery of the Hoosac Tunnel journals triggered an immediate, systemic crisis across the political and industrial landscape of Massachusetts. The exposure of the corporate calculations that had been used to justify the suspension of the rescue efforts forced a complete restructuring of the state's oversight boards, leading to the deployment of strict, mandatory safety laws for all subsequent subsurface engineering projects across the country. The central ventilation shaft was eventually rebuilt, its stone mouth heavily reinforced with concrete architecture, and the tunnel itself was completed in 1875, yet the property carries a permanent, heavy atmospheric weight that causes contemporary rail operators to maintain absolute vigilance when navigating the line. The case stands as a permanent testament to a moment when corporate statistics were weaponized to overwrite human survival, converting a group of living men into a hidden statistic trapped inside the very mountain they were ordered to tame. The cold stillness of the Massachusetts stone offers no further answers, its heavy chambers holding the secrets of 1867 in a permanent grip, much like the changing boundaries of our next destination, where a massive tract of desert land would become the tracking field for an anomalous force that completely fractured the known boundaries of physical law. The claustrophobic depths of the earth, where heavy stone vaults can trap a human life between the rhythmic sounds of ongoing industry and an absolute suffocating silence, demonstrate how completely unyielding our physical environment can be. Yet, when we move out of the dark, enclosed railway passages of the East Coast and venture into the vast, open, high desert landscapes of the American West, the boundaries of reality do not soften. Instead, the landscape changes into something entirely unpredictable, a space where the very laws of physical science and structural geometry appear to bend and break under the weight of an invisible force. In the late summer of 1994, a hard-working cattle ranching family sought nothing more than a quiet, isolated property to establish a premium agricultural operation. They selected a remote, beautiful ranch nestled within the Uintah Basin of northeastern Utah, a unique geographical depression bordered by ancient ridges, heavy timber groves, and a long history of native folklore that the modern world had systematically dismissed as mere superstition. The property spanned hundreds of acres of fertile pasture land, offering an ideal setting for raising elite hybrid cattle. However, from the exact moment the family completed the purchase and received the keys to the main residential structure, they realized the property had been heavily modified by the previous owners in a manner that defied every standard of rural architecture. As the family initiated the process of moving their belongings into the single-story homestead, they discovered heavy commercial deadbolts installed on both the exterior and interior faces of every single door, including the closets. Massive industrial-grade iron chains were welded across the perimeter window frames, and the previous occupants had completely vanished without leaving a single forwarding registry, leaving behind an atmospheric weight that felt immediately dense and unwelcoming. The family attempted to establish a baseline of normal agricultural routine, ignoring the persistent sensation of being watched by an unseen entity as they cleared the lower pastures and monitored their breeding stock. But within less than 3 weeks of their arrival, the baseline security of the ranch completely fractured, initiating a sequence of anomalous events that would ultimately transform the property into the most heavily monitored private scientific sanctuary on Earth. The first definitive breakdown occurred during a clear, hot afternoon when the father and his son were executing a routine perimeter check along the southern boundary line of the pastures. Standing quietly near the edge of the brush was an impossible timber wolf, an apex predator that measured over 3 times the size of any native specimen documented by regional wildlife registries. The creature exhibited an absolute absence of natural fear, walking calmly toward the family's secure holding pens with a slow, docile cadence. Intrigued by the animal's bizarre proportions and calm demeanor, the family approached the fence line. Suddenly, the wolf's posture shifted into one of extreme physical aggression. It lunged through the wire grid, clamping its massive jaws onto the forearm of a young calf with immense physical pressure. The father instantly retrieved a high-powered, large-caliber hunting rifle from his utility vehicle, stepped within a distance of fewer than 3 meters, and fired a direct round squarely into the center of the wolf's torso. The impact of the ball was clearly audible across the pasture, yet the creature did not flinch, flail, or exhibit any physiological response. The father cycled the action, firing a second and third round into the animal's vital organs at point-blank range. The physics of the encounter completely frustrated the witnesses. The high-velocity rounds left distinct, smoking entry marks through the animal's hide, yet there was an absolute absence of blood spatter, tissue damage, or any signs of internal hemorrhaging. The wolf calmly released the calf, turned its head toward the tracking party with a cold, completely detached expression, and walked slowly back into the dense underbrush. The father and son followed the physical path of the animal for over a kilometer through the soft desert earth, but the tracking sequence quickly dissolved into a logical deadlock. The wolf's paw prints were perfectly clear for several hundred meters, showing a consistent structural weight, before stopping instantly in the absolute center of an open clearing, with 0 exit markers or signs of a leap, leaving behind no biological trail, no blood pooling, and an environment that had fallen into an immediate, suffocating silence. Following this initial anomaly, the structural security of the ranch degenerated into absolute chaos. The family began to witness physical spheres of intense orange light floating silently across the low ridges of the property, operating with an impossible velocity that bypassed any known technology of the era. These visual phenomena were not passive lights. They generated intense, localized electromagnetic interference, causing the internal circuitry of farming equipment and residential appliances to completely short-circuit. The terror reached a definitive peak when the father deployed 3 of his prize blue-tick hunting hounds to track a persistent, low-frequency humming sound that was radiating from the darkness of the north pasture. The dogs charged into the brush, their vocalizations echoing cleanly through the canyon walls, before abruptly terminating in a sharp, synchronized cry of extreme distress. The father rushed to the coordinates with his utility lantern, expecting to find evidence of a localized predator attack. Instead, he discovered an environment that had been subjected to an impossible application of thermal energy. The brush was completely untouched by fire, but resting on the grass were 3 small, perfectly circular rings of scorched, greasy black ash. The physical framework of the animals had been completely vaporized. Their collars and metal tags melted into uniform silver pools within the center of the ash rings, showing 0 blood spatter or signs of a physical struggle. The psychological attrition forced the family to abandon the property, selling the entire acreage to an elite, highly funded scientific research cooperative managed by a prominent aerospace billionaire. The organization approached the ranch not as a supernatural mystery, but as a physical, real-world crime scene, deploying a permanent team of senior physicists, forensic pathologists, and intelligence analysts to establish a highly structured diagnostic perimeter around the Uinta Basin site. The researchers completely enclosed the property with high-tech security fences, motion-activated tracking arrays, and advanced multi-spectrum monitoring equipment designed to log data 24 hours a day. The scientific command structure initially followed several logical red herrings, attempting to deconstruct the phenomena utilizing contemporary tactical paradigms. The primary hypothesis framed the occurrences as part of a highly classified, black-budget military testing protocol originating from restricted federal installations located in the neighboring desert zones. The engineers assumed that advanced holographic projection systems, directed energy weapons, and experimental silent propulsion drones were being operated across the ranch coordinates to gauge human psychological response and device vulnerabilities. For months, the research team focused heavily on tracking regional airspace logs, monitoring military communications frequencies, and checking shipping manifests for advanced electronic shielding hardware. However, as the magnetometers and data logs compiled hundreds of operational hours, this technological theory completely collapsed. The specialized sensors recorded massive structural distortions in the local magnetic field that required more energy than the entire regional power grid could generate in a year, and the surges occurred completely detached from any external aircraft activity or military deployment schedules. A secondary red herring emerged when seismic instruments recorded low-frequency microtremors beneath the main pasture, leading geologists to suggest that unique tectonic stress fields within the basin were generating localized piezoelectric phenomena, effectively creating natural plasma spheres that could mimic intelligent movement. Yet, a rigorous analysis of the telemetry data revealed that the electromagnetic surges and visual light spheres occurred completely independent of any structural movement within the subterranean rock strata, leaving the scientific ledger deadlocked and the research cooperative facing a total vacuum of empirical explanations. The definitive turning point in the multi-year investigation occurred during a bitter, moonless night in the winter of the research deployment. The monitoring station's primary automated telemetry logs began to flag a massive, synchronized failure across several independent sensor grids located in the central pasture zone. Standard night vision video streams began to flicker with a heavy layer of digital static, and advanced radio spectrum analyzers recorded a total, localized drop in ambient frequencies, as if the physical space itself were actively absorbing the surrounding electronic signals. The on-site team leader noted with immediate alarm that the localized radiation sensors were climbing exponentially, mapping an intense saturation of non-ionizing energy that remained entirely confined within a strict, invisible geometric column measuring exactly 20 meters in diameter. As the technicians adjusted their custom-engineered multi-spectrum visualization arrays, which combined real-time infrared trackers, high-density thermal sensors, and state-of-the-art night vision lenses, the true, deeply unsettling reality of the Uinta Basin anomaly began to materialize on the terminal screens, completely shattering the baseline paradigm of contemporary physical law. The specialized lenses did not reveal a hidden military drone, a cloaked aircraft, or a native animal matrix. Instead, the multispectrum data captured a literal absolute geometric Weitratsch, or a two-dimensional tear, folding open cleanly against the empty backdrop of the night sky. The interior of the spatial rift did not reflect the surrounding desert landscape. It revealed a total vacuum of absolute blackness that appeared to exist completely outside the dimensions of the local environment. Through this dark, unfolding corridor, a massive, muscular humanoid entity was observed physically crawling out from the interior of the rift, its physical frame distorting the surrounding thermal signatures as it dropped heavily onto the soft desert earth before slipping silently into the low brush of the pasture. The investigative reenactment of the sequence was executed with extreme structural speed and forensic precision. Within fewer than 5 minutes of the visual recording, a specialized containment team equipped with comprehensive hazardous material gear and forensic collection kits arrived at the exact physical coordinates where the entity had crossed into the pasture. Utilizing high-intensity ultraviolet scanners to sweep the soft earth, the researchers located a series of distinct physical impressions pressed deeply into the desert soil. The tracking sequence revealed a pattern that defied every known law of biological locomotion. The entity's footprints, resembling a heavy bipedal hoof structure with a unique linear indentation, extended for exactly 3 paces across the open dirt before terminating in absolute symmetry. There were no directional exit markers, no scuff lines indicating a sudden leap, and no secondary impressions in the surrounding mud. The path simply ceased to exist, perfectly mirroring the visual data of the spatial collapse recorded by the multispectrum cameras. The on-site laboratory technicians immediately performed a comprehensive chemical and molecular analysis of the soil material retrieved from the interior boundaries of the 3 footprints. The forensic results revealed that the earth within the impressions had been subjected to an instantaneous application of extreme, localized energy that had completely altered the crystalline matrix of the sand, vitrifying the top layer of soil into a dense, non-reflective glass structure. The chemical analysis indicated that the primary organic compounds within the dirt had been completely broken down by intense heat, leaving behind a highly concentrated, superheated residue that was actively off-gassing a dense volume of ozone gas. The intense odor of ozone, combined with the absolute vitrification of the Earth, delivered empirical proof that the preceding decades of ranch anomalies, the bulletproof timber wolf, the vaporization of the hunting hounds, the silent displacement of heavy agricultural machinery, and the floating light spheres were not random, disconnected supernatural visitations. They were the physical, real-world thermodynamic artifacts of a continuous, unstable spatial gateway intersecting seamlessly with the local geography of the Uinta Basin. The previous family had not been targeted by a localized criminal or an environmental disease. Their household had simply been positioned directly adjacent to a structural weakness in the fabric of space-time itself, a weakness that was actively being utilized by an unmeasurable intelligence to conduct a long-term extraction operation on the biology of our world. Skinwalker Ranch remains closed behind a secure, highly restricted military-grade perimeter. Its true internal datasets guarded by an intricate network of private corporate security details, strict non-disclosure registries, and federal protective laws that prevent any unauthorized disclosure to the public markets. The Billionaire Research Cooperative continues to process terabytes of multispectrum data from the central pasture, tracking the erratic, unpredictable opening of the spatial rifts with advanced diagnostic hardware that has never been released to standard universities. The property stands as a silent, terrifying monument to the absolute limitations of human science, forcing a complete reconsideration of the physical frameworks we utilize to navigate our daily lives. The true horror of the basin resides in the cold, unyielding reality of its design, the understanding that the stable, predictable world we see through our bedroom windows may simply be a fragile fabric stretched over dark, unmeasurable corridors that can tear open without a single sound under a lonely desert sky, allowing things from the dark to step cleanly into our reality while the modern world continues to sleep. The heavy silence of the Utah desert offers no further compromise, its superheated stone holding the secrets of the basin in a permanent grip, much like the centuries-old historical ledger of our next destination, where a series of sudden, fatal medical anomalies would systematically hunt down the leadership of an entire town across 3 full centuries of human law. The profound high strangeness of modern spatial anomalies, where the very fabric of physical reality can be ripped open above a lonely desert pasture, often leaves the contemporary mind seeking comfort in the clinical frameworks of advanced physics and technological surveillance. We tell ourselves that with enough sensors, enough military-grade data, and enough corporate capital, any distortion of our world can eventually be mapped, managed, and understood. Yet, when we leave the vast, unmanaged horizons of the American West and turn our path back toward the salt-crusted, fog-heavy coastlines of colonial New England, we are forced to confront a much darker reality. There are some distortions that do not originate from an external spatial rift, but are engineered directly out of the raw density of human trauma, structural injustice, and an absolute, unyielding exercise of legal vengeance. To explore this atmospheric shift, we step away from the technological perimeters of the 20th century and descend directly into the tight, wood-framed architecture of Salem, Massachusetts, during the bitter, dark autumn of the year 1692. During this specific historical era, the entire Massachusetts Bay Colony was operating within a state of absolute systemic breakdown. The community of Salem was a highly volatile matrix of extreme religious extremism, constant fear of localized frontier conflicts, and a deep, simmering network of generational land disputes that split neighbors along rigid economic lines. The local legal frameworks were completely dominated by a group of elite, high-ranking magistrates who operated under the absolute authority of the crown, utilizing a specialized court system that allowed for the introduction of phantom data, what the Puritan judges classified as spectral evidence. Within this oppressive social architecture, an accusation of witchcraft was not merely a spiritual charge, it was a highly efficient corporate mechanism utilized by the state to execute property confiscation. The colonial laws dictated that the exact moment an individual was formally convicted of a capital crime against the church, their entire estate, including multiple hundreds of acres of prime, highly valuable agricultural real estate, would be permanently seized by the court and sold to wealthy, high-ranking actors within the judicial command structure, leaving their surviving descendants completely destitute. It was within this trap of absolute legal greed that Giles Corey, an 81-year-old independent landowner, decided to execute a strategy of absolute defiance that would permanently alter the landscape of the town. Giles was a figure of legendary physical power, immense stubbornness, and significant material wealth, having spent decades clearing and defending a massive, prosperous homestead on the outskirts of the Salem township. He had watched, in clear, silent fury as the local magistrates systematically arrested and executed prominent citizens, including his own wife, using these spectral courtroom proceedings to pulverize the long-standing families of the county and absorb their assets. When the panicked circle of local accusers inevitably leveled a formal charge of sung by queer do against Giles himself, the elderly landowner recognized the hidden financial physics of the trap. He understood that if he sat in the courthouse, entered a standard plea, and allowed the trial to initiate, his conviction was a mathematical certainty, and his ancestral real estate would be permanently wiped from his family's ledger. Giles Corey responded with a tactical choice that completely deadlocked the colonial court system. When he was marched into the stone courtroom in September of 1692 and ordered by the judges to enter a verbal plea of guilty or not guilty, Giles simply stood mute. He closed his lips with absolute force, completely refusing to utter a single syllable. Under the complex doctrines of English common law operating at the time, a criminal trial could not legally commence until the accused formally acknowledged the court's jurisdiction by entering a plea. By maintaining an absolute, unyielding silence, Giles effectively froze the machinery of property confiscation. If he could not be tried, he could not be convicted, and if he could not be convicted, the state possessed zero legal authority to seize his lands, guaranteeing that his massive estate would pass cleanly to his loyal sons-in-law upon his death. Frustrated by this structural deadlock and terrified that other wealthy landowners would replicate the strategy, the magistrates invoked an archaic, exceptionally brutal common law procedure that had rarely been witnessed on American soil: peine forte et dure, a phrase translating from the Old French text to literally mean strong and heavy pain. The legal parameters of this torture authorized the sheriff to apply severe, continuous static physical pressure to the body of the accused until a verbal plea was forced from their lips or the physiological threshold of the individual was completely surpassed. The execution of this procedure was carried out on a bleak, gray morning along a dirt pathway adjacent to the Salem prison architecture. Giles Corey was marched into the open air, stripped completely bare by the jailers, and laid flat upon his back on the cold, damp earth. The execution party, directed by Sheriff George Corwin, a ruthless, 26-year-old enforcer who had built a reputation for extreme greed and physical brutality during the Puritan cleanups, positioned a massive, heavy wooden door directly over Giles's exposed chest cavity. Corwin then ordered his deputies to begin retrieving massive, irregular granite boulders from a nearby stone wall, systematically stacking the heavy blocks onto the wooden platform. The physical physics of the torture generated an extreme, slow-motion application of blunt force trauma across Giles's entire torso. As the weight of the granite stones climbed to hundreds of pounds, the wooden door pressed with immense static force into his ribcage, slowly compressing his thoracic cavity and making the act of respiration an agonizing impossibility. The crowd of local townspeople and high-ranking magistrates stood in a tight perimeter, watching with absolute clarity as the heavy timbers began to bow. Periodically, the court recorders would kneel down adjacent to the wooden board, demanding that the 81-year-old man utter the single word required to initiate the trial and stop the pain. Every single time the legal apparatus demanded his submission, Giles Corey utilized his dwindling oxygen reserves to deliver only an absolute, legendary defiance. He clenched his jaw against the crushing physics of the stone, gasping through the crimson froth of his lips, a single clear command that echoed across the field: more weight. Sheriff Corwin, filled with absolute rage at the old man's refusal to break, actively leaped onto the top of the granite boulders himself, adding his own physical mass to the crushing platform to force a collapse. The immense static compression reached a critical peak, causing the structural framework of Giles's ribs to completely splinter, his internal chest organs being slowly and systematically pulverized against the damp earth below. Before the final crushing stone extinguished his physiological baseline, Giles Corey turned his head away from the magistrates, focused his eyes directly onto the face of the young sheriff, and used his absolute final breath to utter a freezing, multi-generation curse that would bopnet the bloodlines of Salem law enforcement for 3 full centuries. He cursed George Corwin, he cursed the town, and he declared that from that exact hour, the weight of his crushed chest would sit permanently upon the heart of every single individual who would ever hold the title of Sheriff of Salem. Giles Corey then lost consciousness and died in absolute silence, his land safely preserved for his descendants, leaving behind a cold, fractured landscape that was about to compile a deeply disturbing forensic ledger. The initial indicators that something had gone profoundly wrong within the leadership of Salem emerged just 4 years later, in 1696. George Corwin, having retired from his active role as sheriff to enjoy the wealth he had extracted during the witch trials, was sitting quietly in his residential quarters when he experienced a sudden, catastrophic medical breakdown. At the age of only 30, an age when a physical enforcer should be at the absolute peak of health, Corwin's vascular system completely failed. He collapsed onto the floorboards, his chest cavity filling with a sudden cascade of blood from a massive, unexplainable cardiovascular explosion, an event that modern medical examiners would classify as a ruptured aortic aneurysm. The suddenness of his demise, combined with the fact that his body had to be temporarily buried inside the cellar of his own home to protect it from angry townspeople seeking to deface his remains, sent a low-frequency wave of unease through the county. As the decades transitioned into centuries, the singular medical anomaly surrounding George Corwin transformed into a massive, statistically impossible pattern of physical destruction that selectively hunted the leadership of the Essex County Sheriff's Department. Medical historians, statistical analysts, and epidemiological researchers looking back across the historical ledger of Salem discovered an operational reality that defied every baseline metric of public health. Sheriff after sheriff, stepping into the active command seat of the Salem office, would experience an absolute collapse of their cardiovascular or circulatory health while holding the title. During the 19th and 20th centuries, researchers attempting to analyze this phenomenon followed multiple regional red herrings, desperate to find a rational, scientific explanation for why the leadership of this specific office was experiencing such an unprecedented mortality rate. The primary epidemiological hypothesis argued that the unique coastal geography of Salem, characterized by low-lying salt marshes, stagnant drainage channels, and damp historical brick architecture, had created a highly localized epicenter for waterborne pathogens or toxic fungal mold colonies. Scientists suggested that a continuous exposure to these specialized environmental toxins within the secure archival vaults of the sheriff's headquarters was triggering chronic internal inflammation, leading to accelerated arterial disease and sudden myocardial infractions among the sedentary administrative staff. To verify this environmental theory, corporate research teams and state health officials executed extensive soil sampling campaigns, tested the wood strata of the old buildings, and checked warehouse manifests for historical lead pipeline contamination. Yet, the diagnostic data completely frustrated the investigators. The ambient air quality readings and toxicity metrics within the Salem office were entirely identical to those of neighboring public structures across Massachusetts, showing zero structural defects or chemical anomalies that could account for selective patterns of human attrition. A secondary, highly publicized red herring emerged when regional medical teams hypothesized that the clustering of cardiovascular explosions was the output of a complex, hidden genetic predisposition passed down through the dominant political dynasties of Essex County. For generations, the civic leadership positions in Salem had been tightly controlled by a small network of overlapping families who frequently intermarried to preserve their local real estate portfolios. Researchers spent months tracing intricate genealogical maps, checking historical parish birth registries, and analyzing the family medical trees of the deceased sheriffs, attempting to isolate a hereditary blood disorder or a congenital heart defect that was selectively passing through the leadership ranks. This biological theory completely collapsed, however, when a rigorous audit of the personnel logs revealed that as the 20th century progressed, the state began appointing sheriffs from entirely distinct geographic origins. Individuals who had been raised in completely separate states, possessed zero ancestral links to the original Puritan families, and exhibited clean, exemplary health profiles prior to entering the Salem workspace. Yet, the moment these foreign actors assumed the title and crossed the threshold of the office, their physiological baselines would rapidly degenerate, matching the exact clinical presentation of their predecessors. The definitive turning point in the case did not arrive through localized biological testing or the discovery of missing administrative folders. It occurred when an independent cooperative of historical epidemiologists completed a comprehensive, multi-century comparative statistical audit of the entire law enforcement infrastructure of the state of Massachusetts. The research cooperative compiled the complete tracking logs of every single sheriff's department across all 14 independent counties of the state, mapping the life expectancy, cause of death, and operational duration of every single commander from the year 1692 to the late 20th century. When the computational data was finalized and displayed across the comparative tables, the absolute chilling scale of the Salem anomaly became undeniable. The statistical models demonstrated that across 13 of the 14 counties, the sheriffs exhibited completely standard longevity metrics, their survival rates perfectly aligning with the baseline health averages of the general public for their respective eras. The data for Essex County, centered in Salem, stood out like a massive, terrifying anomaly. The mathematical tracking revealed that for exactly 300 consecutive years, every single individual who accepted the title of Sheriff of Salem was either struck down by a sudden, fatal myocardial infraction while actively on duty, or was forced into an immediate, emergency resignation due to the rapid onset of acute vascular disorders, catastrophic strokes, or unexplainable blood collapses. The reenactment of the true historical timeline based on this multi-century dataset revealed a mechanical precision that sent a wave of cold clarity through the legal and medical communities. The phenomenon was completely independent of genetics, lifestyle choices, regional pathogens, or environmental toxins. The sheriffs who dropped dead at their desks or experienced sudden, blinding strokes in their utility vehicles were men of entirely different generations. Some were physically fit, veterans of the world wars, others were quiet administrative specialists of the modern era, yet they were bound together by a single, unyielding constraint: the exact operational parameters of their workspace. The tracking proved that the structural landscape of Salem had permanently retained the energetic imprint of the trauma executed upon Susquehanna Road in 1692. The curse of Giles Corey was operating with the cold, absolute reliability of a physical law, systematically bopnet the cardiovascular systems of the state's enforcers the exact moment they attempted to operate the legal apparatus that had been built upon a foundation of judicial murder. The permanent resolution of this multi-century pattern was completed not by a medical breakthrough or a spiritual intervention, but by a sudden, radical restructuring of the state's administrative infrastructure in the late 20th century. In the early winter of 1991, facing a deep wave of systemic financial pressure, shifting municipal boundaries, and an unexplainable clustering of high-stress medical emergencies among the active command staff, the Massachusetts legislature stepped in to execute a total overhaul of the regional judiciary. They passed an emergency administrative decree that completely and legally dissolved the historical office of the Salem Sheriff's Department, permanently transferring all regional detention and law enforcement operations to centralized state structures and completely wiping the ancient Essex County seat from the legal ledger. The structural erasure of the office achieved what 300 years of medicine could not: the sudden, absolute termination of the anomaly pattern. Since the legal dissolution of the department in 1991, no further unexplainable cardiovascular explosions have been logged among the regional transit personnel or the contemporary security coordinators who manage the historical tourist zones of the town. The frame buildings and brick coordinates where George Corwin once directed his enforcers have been largely converted into sanitized museums, historical gift shops, and public walking paths where millions of oblivious tourists move every single year, completely insulated from the heavy reality of the soil. The true, lingering horror of the Salem Ledger resides in the understanding that human architecture and local law are not always static, neutral landscapes. Some actions are so profoundly broken, so entirely detached from natural justice, that they can warp the very biology of a location for centuries, creating a silent debt that must be paid out in blood through generations of innocent actors until the state itself is forced to completely delete the structure to find peace. The cold weight of the Massachusetts coast offers no further validation, its historic streets holding the secrets of 1692 in a permanent grip, much like the frozen timber tracts of our next destination, where a massive tract of protected marshland would become the hunting field for an entity that left behind a trail of physical footprints that completely fractured the known parameters of animal locomotion. The historical transition from a multi-century legal curse to a modern environmental anomaly often operates through a sudden, dramatic expansion of the tracking field, moving away from the tight, wood-framed courtrooms of colonial townships and settling directly into the vast, unforgiving wilderness systems of the American Eastern Seaboard. To understand how a community's baseline security can be completely overwhelmed by a physical threat, one must venture into the dense, frozen expanse of southern New Jersey during the early weeks of the year 1909. The region was dominated by the Pine Barrens, a massive protected tract of over 1 million acres of dense pitch pine forest, cedar swamps, and acidic waterways that had remained largely untamed since the colonial era. Scattered along the perimeter of this primeval wilderness were small, isolated ironworking communities, glassmaking towns, and quiet agricultural settlements that relied on the absolute predictability of the landscape for their economic survival. The winter of 1909 had blanketed the state in a series of severe sub-zero freezes and heavy snowfalls, locking the rural communities into a quiet, structured isolation where the only sounds were the regular hum of regional factories and the crunch of boots across the deep drifts. Yet, it was within this fragile winter sanctuary that an unexplainable presence would trigger a week of absolute multi-town mass panic, forcing state infrastructure to a complete standstill and leaving behind a forensic tracking puzzle that completely fractured the known parameters of biological science. To fully deconstruct the investigative process that governed this historic event, one must first look at the psychological framework of the communities bordering the Pinelands. For over 170 years, the regional folklore had been saturated with the historical narrative of Mother Leeds and her 13th child, a colonial myth dating back to the year 1735, which claimed a cursed, winged entity with horse-like features and bipedal hooves inhabited the deep, unmapped core of the pine forest. While contemporary civic leaders and factory managers publicly dismissed the legend as a harmless, archaic superstition utilized to keep children away from the dangerous swamplands, the cultural memory of the entity remained deeply integrated into the landscape. The people of southern New Jersey possessed an intimate familiarity with the natural wildlife of the region. They were experienced woodsmen, trackers, and farmers who could instantly identify the seasonal migratory patterns of native birds and the standard footprints left by deer, foxes, and regional predators in the winter snow. The baseline security of these towns relied on this absolute understanding of the natural order, the certainty that whatever moved in the darkness of the timber could be categorized, hunted, and managed by human means. The illusion of this ecological control completely evaporated during the week of January 16th to January 23rd, 1909. The crisis initiated seamlessly on the morning of January 17th, when citizens across multiple independent municipal districts, including the townships of Bristol, Burlington, and the crowded urban perimeters of Camden, emerged from their residences to discover a completely anomalous structural disruption in the fresh, undisturbed snow. Marshal Benjamin Trench, a seasoned law enforcement official tasked with managing the civic security of the Burlington district, was summoned to a residential avenue by a group of highly agitated property owners. Standing adjacent to a row of pristine snowdrifts, the marshal was forced to confront a physical signature that defied every established doctrine of tracking biology. Pressed deeply into the frozen crust of the snow was a continuous, single-file trail of clear, bipedal prints. The impressions did not resemble the human boot tracks or the standard four-legged strides of regional livestock. Each independent print was a clean, meticulously defined, double-toed hoof structure, measuring approximately 10 centimeters in length and exhibiting an absolute, cold precision that suggested an immense localized weight. The panic rapidly escalated from a localized anomaly into a massive statewide emergency as identical tracking reports saturated the regional telegraph and telephone networks. Within less than 48 hours, hundreds of independent sightings were formally logged with local marshals and municipal councils across a geographic radius exceeding 80 kilometers. Witnesses universally described a highly volatile, visually terrifying entity operating in total silence across the rooftops of the settlements, a creature displaying a massive horse-like skull, elongated reptilian hind limbs terminating in heavy hooves, large bat-like wing structures, and short, clawed front extremities. The ambient terror became so dense that the social infrastructure of southern New Jersey simply collapsed. Factory directors reported an absolute absence of their labor force as workers refused to navigate the dark rural pathways to their shifts. Municipal school boards issued emergency orders to completely close all educational facilities across 3 counties, and the state government was ultimately forced to mobilize specialized units of the state militia to conduct armed night patrols along the perimeter of the Pine Barrens. Faced with a complete breakdown of public order, Marshall Trench and a cooperative of regional law enforcement officials launched a resource-heavy forensic investigation, treating the panic as a highly coordinated, large-scale criminal disruption or a dangerous ecological intrusion. Investigators immediately encountered a series of plausible red herrings that threatened to derail the reasoning process of the state. The primary scientific hypothesis, presented by a prominent zoologist from a metropolitan museum in Philadelphia, argued that the tracking data was the output of an escaped exotic animal, specifically a specialized species of Australian sandhill crane or a stray wallaby that had broken free from a transient traveling menagerie or a private estate during the confusion of the recent winter storms. The theory suggested that the unique bipedal gait of the bird, distorted by the gradual melting and refreezing of the snow crystals along the edges of the prints, could easily mimic a double-toed hoof configuration to an untrained civilian eye. Detectives spent days cross-checking the licensing manifests of all regional circuses, interviewing exotic animal importers along the Philadelphia docks, and deploying tracking hounds to locate any hidden nesting sites within the low brush. However, the exotic animal theory completely collapsed when forensic specialists noted that the average spacing between the prints remained perfectly uniform across hundreds of meters of varied terrain, indicating a mechanical stability and velocity that no single panicking flightless bird or displaced marsupial could maintain through sub-zero snowdrifts. A secondary, highly sensationalized red herring emerged when corporate factory owners suggested the panic was an elaborate, large-scale industrial hoax engineered by radical labor union organizers. The managers argued that the union leadership had utilized custom-fabricated wooden tracking stamps, mounting the double-toed hoof designs onto long stilts to manually print the tracks across the residential avenues during the midnight hours, successfully triggering a widespread civilian panic that forced a total shutdown of the regional manufacturing plants without initiating an active strike. Marshall Trench aggressively pursued this angle, conducting unannounced searches of local carpentry workshops, auditing chemical manifests for industrial rubber manufacturing, and interrogating known labor agitators across the district. Yet, the physics of human orchestration completely eliminated this explanation. When tracking specialists mapped the complete trajectory of the prints, they discovered that the single-file trail moved seamlessly across multiple independent counties simultaneously during a night of extreme blizzard conditions, a timeline that would require a synchronized operational force of thousands of highly trained human actors moving in total synchronization through sub-zero darkness without leaving a single trace of human boot tracks, vehicular support, or internal coordination. The definitive turning point in the statewide investigation occurred when Marshall Trench called in Silas Vance, a legendary wilderness tracker who had spent over 3 decades mapping the interior core of the Pine Barrens for the State Forestry Service. Vance bypassed the theatrical chaos of the public sightings and focused his reasoning process entirely on the cold, immutable physical metrics of the tracking paths. He conducted a microscopic analysis of the ice crystal formations inside the floor of the hoofprints, utilizing primitive forensic thermal metrics to confirm that the impressions had been introduced into the snow matrix at the absolute height of the sub-zero freeze, completely eliminating any possibility that the tracks had been stamped or carved after the snow had solidified. As Vance and Marshall Trench systematically followed a pristine, undisturbed tracking line that initiated along the wild timber boundary of the Burlington district, they reached a structural milestone that shattered every remaining terrestrial and mechanical hypothesis. The single-file trail of double-toed hoofprints did not navigate around the architectural obstacles of the human settlements. It ran in a straight, absolute vector directly toward the exterior wall of a two-story residential brick structure. The reenactment of the true physical timeline, mapped out step by step by the tracking specialists, revealed a reality that sent a wave of raw, primitive terror through the law enforcement command structure. The prints approached the vertical brick facade of the home and simply continued upward without a single alteration in their spacing, depth, or orientation. The physics of the prints demonstrated that the entity had walked horizontally across the frozen earth, stepped seamlessly onto the vertical brick wall, traveled straight up the vertical plane against the absolute baseline of gravity, and continued its stride along the narrow, snow-covered ridge of the rooftop. Deeper within the data logs of the tracking party, Vance located a tracking sequence that moved cleanly from the edge of the residential roof and transitioned directly onto an active, high-voltage telephone and electrical line structure suspended over 12 meters above the street. The double-toed hoofprints were pressed precisely into the thin layer of ice coating the dangerous live wires. The entity had walked along the single narrow cable with the absolute stability of a predatory cat, navigating across multiple independent telephone poles without fracturing the fragile ceramic insulators, disrupting the high-voltage electrical current, or leaving a single mark of thermal singeing, carbon scoring, or grounding Bermga. The path extended along the live electrical wire matrix for over 200 meters, before terminating in absolute geometric symmetry in the center of an open and closed courtyard, the prints vanishing instantly into the upper air without a single exit trace on the surrounding earth. The forensic results compiled by Silas Vance delivered empirical proof that the 1909 panic was not a manifestation of civilian mass hysteria, nor was it a coordinated human prank or an escaped exotic specimen. The physical tracks left on the high-voltage lines and the vertical brick structures demonstrated an entity that operated under a physics framework entirely alien to known terrestrial biology. The configuration of the hoof marks, combined with the impossible lightness required to traverse high-voltage lines without triggering a massive electrical discharge or breaking the fragile copper cables, indicated a physical density that could fluctuate at will, allowing the creature to interface with the material environment or detach from its physical constraints entirely. The Pine Barrens were not merely a dense forest. They represented a massive, unmanaged biological repository where a prehistoric, the anomalous entity had successfully maintained an isolation corridor for centuries, occasionally emerging to utilize the infrastructure of human settlements as a continuous elevated highway grid for its own migration patterns. The Jersey Devil Panic of 1909 dissolved as rapidly as it had initiated, terminating abruptly on January 23rd when a massive atmospheric shift brought a sudden regional thaw, completely melting the snowdrifts and deleting the impossible tracks from the landscape. Despite decades of advanced historical auditing, tracking through state conservation records, and crossing-checking structural data, no modern zoological study has ever been able to provide a conventional explanation for the physical tracking logs preserved within the state archives. The official municipal reports were eventually quietly classified by state directors, buried deep within the restricted vaults of the New Jersey Legal Archives to prevent a permanent crisis of public confidence regarding the absolute safety of the state's expanding infrastructure. The legend returned to the realm of sanitized folklore, transformed into a cartoonish cultural mascot that allows the modern inhabitants of the region to look at the dark wall of the Pine Barrens with a safe, comfortable detachment. The true, lingering horror of the 1909 ledger resides in the understanding that our contemporary engineering projects, our electrical grids, our highways, and our residential developments are often built directly through ancient, unmapped habitats controlled by forces that ignore the absolute parameters of our science. The deep pine forest of southern New Jersey remains entirely unchanged, its dark, acidic swamplands casting the same long shadows over the perimeter towns as they did over a century ago, a silent warning that the lines we string across the sky may simply be serving as an invitation for things from the darkness to step cleanly over our perimeters, much like the massive, technology-draining boulder fields of our final destination, where the physical boundaries of a historic battlefield would construct an invisible circle capable of rendering the most advanced electronic hardware entirely useless within a matter of seconds. The continuous migration of unexplainable physical phenomena across the historical landscapes of North America often demonstrates that the ultimate limits of contemporary science are reached not within highly advanced private laboratories, but within the silent boundaries of our most sacred historical reservations. When a location has been subjected to a massive, concentrated convergence of human trauma and absolute structural violence, the surrounding landscape appears to permanently retain a physical ledger of the event long after the historical witnesses have been cleared from the soil. To fully explore this environmental transformation, our final path leads away from the frozen timberlines of the coastal marshes and settles directly onto the blood-soaked, granite-strewn ridges of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. In the summer of 1863, this rolling agricultural valley became the absolute epicenter of the American Civil War, hosting a 3-day tactical engagement that resulted in more than 50,000 human casualties, completely saturating the earth with the raw thermodynamic signatures of industrial-scale bowhand, blunt force trauma, and absolute catastrophic destruction. Amid the vast network of open pastures and linear ridges that define the battlefield geography, one specific architectural feature has consistently challenged the diagnostic parameters utilized by modern military historians, geologists, and electrical engineers: a natural, prehistoric labyrinth of massive granite boulders known permanently to the public as Devil's Den. Composed of high-density, iron-rich stone blocks piled loosely across a low ravine, this natural fortress saw some of the most intense hand-to-hand combat of the entire campaign during the second day of the battle. Thousands of specialized infantrymen and elite sharpshooters fought within the tight, claustrophobic kedar of the boulders, their bodies subjected to massive artillery impacts and repetitive ballistic wounds before their remains were cleared by the state. In the decades that followed the conclusion of the war, the federal government converted the entire landscape into a highly managed historical park, establishing a rigid, predictable baseline of administrative order characterized by paved tour roads, manicured lawns, and structural bronze monuments designed to guide millions of civilian visitors through the space every single year. Yet, it was within the precise boundary line of this granite boulder maze that contemporary technology would hit an absolute, unyielding wall of interference, a localized operational failure so perfectly calculated it would force a complete reconsideration of how deeply human history can warp the physical laws of our contemporary world. To map the exact diagnostic parameters of this environmental anomaly, a specialized cooperative of optical engineers, electronic technicians, and electromagnetic researchers, directed by Dr. Lawrence Vance, established a temporary tracking deployment around Devil's Den in the early summer of 2026. Dr. Vance was a highly disciplined diagnostic specialist who had spent decades conducting precision surveys of ambient electromagnetic fields for industrial and military contractors. He approached the legendary folklore of the battlefield with an absolute clinical detachment, viewing the persistent public reports of anomalous phenomena, the sudden, total failure of modern digital cameras, the erratic tracking behaviors of cellular devices, and the rapid depletion of high-capacity lithium battery cells inside the rocks as simple, uncalibrated technical errors brought on by tourist mismanagement, intense regional heat waves, or shifting atmospheric humidity patterns. The research cooperative deployed a state-of-the-art array of digital sensors, calibrated magnetometers, and professional high-definition cameras, attempting to treat the granite labyrinth as a standard, neutral container to be systematically measured and mapped within the state registries. The baseline of this scientific control completely fractured during the first afternoon watch of the field deployment. Dr. Vance was operating a highly advanced, fully calibrated digital camera system, executing a series of high-resolution spatial sweeps along the upper ridge of the granite boulders where historic sharpshooter nests had been mapped. The internal telemetry terminal on his equipment recorded an absolute pristine status. The custom-engineered battery cells were at 100% capacity, the optical sensors were completely clear of debris, and the ambient radio frequency monitors showed zero baseline noise. Moving with a practiced, steady cadence, Vance stepped off the paved public pathway and crossed the threshold into the active perimeter of the stone maze. The exact moment his boots transitioned over the structural boundary line, the automated diagnostic system on his camera began to cycle erratically. The bright liquid crystal display screen flickered with a heavy, low-frequency pattern of digital static, before throwing a terminal sensor error code that completely locked the internal mechanism. Vance checked the primary power cell and discovered that the battery status had dropped instantaneously from 100% down to absolute zero, rendering the multi-$1,000 optical system entirely useless within a fraction of a single second. As the research cooperative rushed to troubleshoot the equipment failure, they immediately encountered a series of highly plausible red herrings that threatened to derail their analytical process. The primary engineering hypothesis, presented by a senior geological surveyor, argued that the unexplainable power drains and sensor errors were the direct output of localized geomagnetic fluctuations caused by massive, underground deposits of magnetite iron ore naturally structured into the granite boulders of Devil's Den. The theory suggested that these intense, hidden mineral veins acted as a natural directional mirror, focusing the Earth's ambient magnetic lines into a sharp, compressed beam that could easily overwhelm the delicate solid-state circuitry of modern digital cameras and short-circuit the internal safety microchips of contemporary lithium batteries. To verify this mineral explanation, the team executed a series of deep-core drilling samples across the stone strata, analyzing the exact composition of the rock matrix under laboratory conditions. However, the metallurgical data completely frustrated the geologists. The iron content within the Devil's Den granite was entirely uniform and identical to the rock formations found miles away across Pennsylvania formations that exhibited zero history of electronic interference or sudden power depletion, forcing the team to cross the mineral hypothesis off the tracking registry. A secondary, highly publicized red herring emerged when regional telecommunications specialists suggested that the technical failures were the result of high-frequency radio crosstalk originating from a massive array of commercial broadcast and emergency response towers located on the adjacent ridges of the Gettysburg Township. The engineers argued that the specific spatial geometry of the massive granite boulders created a natural acoustic and electromagnetic echo chamber, trapping the stray ambient radio waves and bouncing the high-frequency signals between the narrow stone pathways until they formed an intense, localized blanket of electronic noise capable of corrupting digital memory cards and triggering false battery indicators on consumer electronic devices. Dr. Vance aggressively pursued this technical angle, deploying advanced shielding fabric and enclosing his diagnostic instruments within portable Faraday cages to block out any external radio wave data. Yet, the physics of the anomaly completely eliminated this explanation. Even inside the heavy copper mesh of the protective containers, the digital gear continued to experience the exact same instantaneous power drops and sensor corruption the moment it was positioned adjacent to the stones, demonstrating an absolute independence from any external broadcast signals or ambient regional frequencies. The definitive turning point in the deadlocked investigation occurred when Dr. Vance decided to bypass the constraints of modern digital technology entirely. Recognizing that solid-state microchips and contemporary electronic circuitry were fundamentally vulnerable to the anomalous field, he turned his reasoning process toward historical analog mechanics. He retrieved a selection of vintage, entirely mechanical cameras manufactured during the mid-20th century, devices that possessed zero internal electrical systems, relying exclusively on physical clockwork gears, manual focal shutters, and traditional chemical film ribbons to capture visual data. If the phenomenon at Devil's Den was a standard electromagnetic or radio wave disruption, it would pass cleanly through the inert plastic and silver halide chemistry of the analog film without causing a single operational error. Vance and his team positioned a mechanical camera alongside a modern digital unit at the exact coordinate matrix where the automated systems consistently failed. As expected, the digital unit sipped nguyen instantly upon crossing the perimeter. Vance calmly cleared the manual shutter of the analog camera, executing a series of physical exposures across the granite boulders under a completely cloudless, brilliant summer sky. He then retreated to a specialized, clinical darkroom environment established at their base station to personally process the chemical film ribbons under controlled development parameters, ensuring that no stray light or environmental variables could compromise the material. As the physical images began to materialize within the chemical baths, the true, deeply unsettling reality of the Gettysburg anomaly was laid bare, upending every conventional engineering paradigm held by the department. The photographs captured by the mechanical camera did not reveal a standard sunny afternoon landscape. Instead, stretching across the entire perimeter of the granite stones was a massive, dense, and absolute structural envelope of an unexplainable black vapor or fog. This charcoal-colored cloud was so thick, so completely opaque, that it completely obscured the direct rays of the sun, casting the boulders into an unnatural twilight. What caused a wave of raw, clinical clarity to cascade through the research cooperative, however, was the baseline reference check. Doctor. Vance had meticulously logged the exact weather data at the moment of the exposure. The sky above Devil's Den was entirely clear, with zero ambient moisture, no smoke, and absolute visibility across the valley. The black vapor visible on the chemical film was entirely invisible to the naked human eye, existing within a light spectrum that bypassed normal human perception, yet possessing a physical density so intense it actively absorbed the incoming visual and electromagnetic spectrum. The reenactment of the true historical timeline, compiled by analyzing the exact spatial boundaries where the analog film recorded the black vapor, revealed an exercise in environmental physics that was entirely engineered out of human tragedy. The phenomenon did not adhere to geological veins or radio towers. The boundaries of the non-reflective cloud matched with absolute precision the exact defensive line held by the soldiers during the catastrophic engagements of 1863. The reenactment demonstrated that the immense, concentrated velocity of kinetic energy, violent physical bouthand, and rapid mass loss of human life that occurred within the closed container of the granite labyrinth had permanently fractured the ambient space surrounding the stones. The trauma had left behind an unyielding, permanent structural field that measured exactly 5 meters from the face of the boulder. In the Catter formations, this invisible envelope acted as a perpetual thermodynamic sink, an environmental drain that treated any incoming contemporary digital technology not as a camera or a telephone, but as an active foreign energy source to be instantaneously grounded, absorbed, and neutralized to preserve the silent, frozen equilibrium of the landscape below. Within those 5 meters, the laws of modern electronics were completely overwritten by the raw historical memory of the soil. The National Park Service maintains a quiet, administrative baseline of non-interference regarding the electronic anomalies of Devil's Den, allowing millions of annual visitors to navigate the paved tour paths and climb across the massive granite blocks with their devices tracking normally, completely oblivious to the fact that they are stepping within arm's reach of a permanent distortion in physical science. No corporate warnings are posted, and no federal registries are updated, yet the localized technical failures continue with an absolute mathematical regularity that modern tech firms cannot fix. The case stands as a permanent cinematic monument to the absolute limitations of contemporary human understanding, reminding us that some footprints are pressed so deeply into the fabric of a location that they can warp the very architecture of reality for centuries, transforming a physical battlefield into a permanent archive that actively fights back against the intrusion of the modern world. The cold stillness of the Gettysburg Stone offers no further compromise, its heavy boulders holding the secrets of 1863 in a permanent, unyielding grip, a final testament to the hidden patterns of shadows and high strangeness that continue to operate right beneath the surface of our predictable world. The narratives presented across this entire audio series are constructed exclusively for historical context, cinematic illustration, and investigative reporting purposes, utilized as a creative reconstruction of real-world events and documented regional anomalies. All discussions regarding internal trauma, forensic pathology protocols, chemical vaporization metrics, or sudden epidemiological health failures are delivered strictly from a diagnostic analysis framework and must not, under any circumstances, be interpreted as professional medical advice, clinical diagnostics, or operational health guidelines. If you or an individual within your domestic perimeter are currently experiencing acute physical distress, unexplainable physiological symptoms, or changes in cardiovascular health baseline metrics, you are strongly instructed to immediately bypass informal tracking data and seek direct professional evaluation from a certified, licensed healthcare practitioner or regional emergency medical authorities. Furthermore, all legal frameworks, structural property codes, and local municipal enforcement protocols discussed within these historical accounts reflect specific historical parameters and must not be utilized as contemporary legal counsel or statutory advice for navigating modern civic. infrastructure, or public land regulations.